Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the wooden gates of a medieval leather tannery, and I need you to understand something right up front. The smell hits you like a physical wall. Imagine every terrible odor you've ever encountered: rotting meat, sewage, ammonia, wet dog that's been dead for a week, then multiply that by 1,000 and trap it in a humid workspace where it's been fermenting for generations. You're standing at the entrance now, hand over your nose, eyes already watering, and you haven't even crossed the threshold. The tanner's apprentice walking past you doesn't even flinch. He's maybe 14 years old, covered in stains you can't identify and don't want to, and he's eating bread with those same hands. Welcome to one of medieval Europe's most essential and absolutely repulsive professions, where the gap between necessary and survivable is about as wide as the gap between you and a good night's sleep after hearing what comes next. You probably think you could tough it out for a day after all. People did this for centuries, right? But here's your reality check. Most modern visitors to historical tannery recreations don't make it 15 minutes before they're outside dry heaving into the authentic medieval shrubbery. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing the global bedtime community we've built. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the outskirts of a prosperous medieval town, let's say somewhere in 13th century France. Though this nightmare was pretty much identical from England to Italy, from the 800s through the 1600s. The tannery sits deliberately downwind and downstream from the main settlement, because even medieval people who thought bathing was spiritually dangerous and kept their chamber pots in the bedroom found this place intolerable. That should tell you something. The compound sprawls across maybe 2 acres, a maze of open pits, covered vats, drying racks, and low-slung workshops with smoke drifting through the rafters. Everything is stained this reddish-brown color that you'll soon learn is the universal hue of the tanning trade. The ground squelches under your feet with moisture that definitely isn't just rainwater. Your guide today is Master Guillaume, a third-generation tanner whose family has worked the same plot since his grandfather's time. He's stocky, surprisingly strong, and his hands look like they've been dipped in walnut stain and left to cure. His apron, which might have been leather once, or might have been cloth. Honestly, it's impossible to tell. Anamorious stiff with years of accumulated. Everything. He sizes you up with the weary expression of someone who's seen plenty of curious outsiders lose their breakfast in his workplace. You'll want to breathe through your mouth. He advises in langue d'oil, the northern French dialect of the era. For the first week. Anyway, after that, you won't notice it. This is a lie. You'll discover, but it's a kind lie meant to get you through the door. The medieval leather industry was absolutely massive, and it's wild how little most people today understand about its scale. Every shoe, every belt, every sword scabbard, every book binding, every piece of armor backing, every bucket and bottle, every hinge and strap leather. In a world before plastics, before rubber, before synthetic materials of any kind, leather was the universal material for anything that needed to be flexible, durable, and water-resistant. Historians estimate that a prosperous medieval town of 10,000 people might support 3 or 4 tanneries of this size, each processing hundreds of hides annually. And here's the quirky bit that doesn't make it into most history books. Tanners were often responsible for the town's stray dog population control because they needed those dogs for reasons we'll get into later. So Master Guillaume also moonlights as a medieval animal control officer, which somehow makes perfect sense and is also deeply concerning. The apprentices are already at work as you arrive just after dawn. There are 6 of them ranging from about 12 to 20 years old, plus 2 journeymen in their 30s who've mastered the craft but don't own their own workshops yet. Everyone starts early in the tannery because the work is genuinely endless. Hides in various stages of processing demand attention around the clock, and timing is everything. Leave a hide in the lime pit too long and it dissolves. Pull it out too early and the hair won't come off. The apprentices live on site in a loft above the main workshop, and you can see their sleeping pallets through the open door. Crude straw mattresses that probably smell like everything else here. They're bound to Master Guillaume for 7 years typically, learning every step of the process in exchange for room, board, and the theoretical promise of joining the Tanners Guild at the end of their term. Guillaume walks you past the receiving area where fresh hides arrive from the butchers. Even in their raw state, before any processing, they're pretty grim. A cow was slaughtered somewhere in town yesterday, and its skin arrived here folded and salted, already attracting flies despite the November chill. Blood has pooled in the creases, and the whole thing weighs maybe 80 pounds dead weight. Literally, awkward and floppy and heavier than you'd expect. The salt is a preservative, keeping the hide from putrefying before the tanners can begin work. But it's not doing anything for the smell. One of the younger apprentices, a kid named Pierre, is tasked with unfolding this hide and rinsing it in the stream that runs along the property's edge. He drags it across the mud-packed ground, leaving a dark, wet trail, completely unbothered by the fact that he's essentially wrestling with a cow's skin before he's even had breakfast. The first step is always cleaning, Guillaume explains, gesturing toward the stream where Pierre is now stomping on the hide in the shallow water, working the salt and blood out with his bare feet. Fresh from the butcher, a hide carries blood, dung, dirt, whatever the animal rolled in during its life. All of that must come out or it will rot in the leather later. You watch Pierre work, and the stream downstream is running visibly pink now. In a larger town, this would cause problems. Dyers downstream hate tanners. Butchers hate tanners. Basically everyone downstream of a tannery hates tanners, but Guillaume's family has been here long enough that they've worked out uneasy truces with their neighbors, probably involving substantial bribes to the town council. Historians still argue whether medieval tanners were technically considered infames, legally infamous persons whose testimony couldn't be trusted in court, or if that was just social prejudice that never made it into actual law. The truth varies by region and century, but the practical reality was pretty universal. Tanners occupied the absolute bottom tier of respectable medieval professions. They weren't quite as stigmatized as executioners or prostitutes, but they were definitely in the conversation. Guild regulations from various European cities sometimes place tanners in special categories, and there are documented cases of tanner families being excluded from holding civic office or marrying into merchant families. The stink literally followed them everywhere. Their clothes absorbed it, their hair held it, even their money supposedly smelled like the workshop. You could identify a tanner walking through the market from 20 paces away, which meant they could never escape their profession, even on their day off. But here's the economic reality that trapped generation after generation in this trade. Leather was expensive and therefore profitable. A single cowhide, properly tanned, could sell for enough to feed a peasant family for a month. The profit margins were substantial enough that tanners, despite their social stigma, were often quite prosperous. Master Guillaume owns this property, employs 8 people, and probably has a stone house in town, though he rarely goes there. The medieval economy ran on leather just as surely as the modern economy runs on petroleum, and someone had to supply it. So you ended up with these multi-generational tanning dynasties. Families who'd been working hides for so long that they'd internalized the social rejection and built their own tight-knit communities on the margins of town. They married other tanners' children. They drank at their own taverns. And they took a grim pride in doing work that literally no one else could stomach. The layout of the tannery makes sense once Guillaume explains the workflow. Though sense is a generous word for what you're witnessing. Hides flow through the compound in stages, each more elaborate and time-consuming than the last. First comes receiving and initial cleaning that's Pierre in the stream. Then comes the beam house, where hides get scraped and treated with various chemicals to remove hair and flesh. Then the tanning pits themselves, where hides soak in specialized liquids for months. Finally, the drying racks and finishing workshop where the leather gets its final treatments. A single hide might spend a year working its way through this process, which means the tannery is always juggling dozens or hundreds of hides in various stages of completion. It's actually impressively organized, in a nightmarish kind of way. You notice dogs lurking around the property's edges, maybe half a dozen of them, skinny and skittish. Guillaume follows your gaze and nods. We keep them fed. He says simply, they keep the rats down. And when we need them for processing, they're already here. This casual statement will make more sense and become more disturbing when we get to the baiting pits in a few hours. For now, just file away the fact that medieval tanners maintained working relationships with semi-feral dogs, and that this arrangement benefited both parties right up until it didn't benefit the dogs anymore. Medieval industries were built on waste stream integration that would make modern recycling programs look primitive. Nothing got thrown away if it could be repurposed, and tanneries were masters of this philosophy, using every disgusting byproduct you can imagine. The sun is fully up now, burning off the morning fog, and you're starting to realize that the smell actually intensifies as the day warms up. The apprentices have finished their bread and weak beer breakfast and are heading to their various stations. Guillaume hands you a leather apron, actually tanned leather, ironically softer and nicer than anything these workers wear, and tells you you'll start with the easiest job, sorting through the lime pit to see which hides are ready for the next stage. Easy is definitely relative here. As you tie the apron strings, you catch yourself wondering if you can still back out, if there's a polite medieval way to say, actually I just remembered I have to be literally anywhere else. But you've come this far, and Master Guillaume is already walking toward a series of sunken pits near the main workshop, gesturing for you to follow. The real work is about to begin, and your modern sensibilities haven't even begun to comprehend what work meant to a medieval tanner. Your hands are already cramping from clenching them unconsciously, trying to avoid touching anything. Guillaume notices and laughs, not unkindly. By the end of today, you'll have stopped worrying about clean hands. He predicts, by the end of the week, you'll have stopped noticing them at all. This is both reassuring and horrifying. The autumn sun climbs higher. The workshop comes fully alive with activity and shouting and the wet sounds of hides being manipulated. And you take your first real breath through your mouth, trying to minimize the sensory assault. It doesn't really work. Welcome to the tannery. You're going to have a very long day. The lime pits stretch before you like medieval chemical warfare craters, 8 rectangular pools sunk into the ground, each about 6 feet deep and 10 feet across, filled with a milky white liquid that looks deceptively innocent from a distance. Close, though. You can see the hides floating just beneath the surface, pale and swollen like drowned things, and the caustic smell adds a sharp, burning edge to the general tannery miasma. Master Guillaume hands you a long wooden pole with a hook on the end and gestures toward the third pit. Those have been soaking for 9 days, he says. Time to check if they're ready. You lower the hook into the liquid, trying not to splash, because one of the apprentices has already warned you that lime water burns exposed skin like liquid fire. Medieval chemistry didn't have precise measurements or safety equipment, so trying not to get caustic solution in your eyes was pretty much the entire safety protocol. You snag a hide and pull it toward the edge of the pit, and immediately your arms strain against the weight. Waterlogged cowhide soaked in lime solution weighs maybe 120 pounds, and it's slippery and unwieldy and fighting you the entire way. Pierre appears at your elbow and helps you haul it onto the sloped stone edge of the pit, where it lies steaming slightly in the cool morning air. The hide is grotesquely swollen, the grain side puffed up like it's been inflated, and tufts of hair are already loosening at the edges. Guillaume pokes it with his finger, leaving an indentation that slowly fills back in, and nods approvingly. Ready for the beam, he announces. You've just participated in one of the most critical steps in leather production. Liming, where alkaline solutions break down the hair roots and swell the collagen fibers, preparing the hide for everything that comes next. The recipe for lime water is straightforward and terrifying in equal measure. You take quicklime calcium oxide, produced by roasting limestone in a kiln until it breaks down, and you add it to water. The reaction is violently exothermic, meaning it generates intense heat, and medieval tanners learned through trial and error, and probably lots of burned apprentices, how much lime to add without literally boiling the solution. Too weak and the hair won't release. Too strong and the hide starts to dissolve. Guillaume's family has been using the same ratios for 3 generations. 3 shovels of lime to 1 full pit of water, stirred until your arms ache, then let it settle overnight. This is folk chemistry at its finest, passed down through oral tradition because most tanners couldn't read or write, and it worked reliably enough to supply entire kingdoms with leather. You help Pierre drag the lime-soaked hide toward the beam house, a 3-sided shed with a massive wooden work surface, the beam set at a 45-degree angle. The beam is essentially a huge, slightly curved wooden plank, smooth from decades of use, positioned so a worker can drape a hide over it and scrape downward with gravity's help. One of the journeymen, a taciturn guy named Raoul, is already working on another hide, and the sound is unforgettable. A rhythmic scraping, squeaking noise as his curved bladea 2-handled scraping knife without a sharp edge pushes hair and lime and dissolved tissue down the hide's surface. Every few strokes, he flips the blade and uses it to squeegee the loosened material onto the ground, where it forms a disgusting pile of gray-white sludge studded with cow hair. Raoul shows you the technique, which looks simple and is absolutely not. You drape the hide over the beam, grain side up, and you take the scraping knife in both hands. The blade is dull by designerie, not cutting. You're pushing and scraping, and you lean your weight into it, dragging it down the hide's length. Immediately, you discover several things. First, your angle is wrong, and you're just sliding ineffectively across the surface. Second, even when you correct your angle, the hide is so slippery with lime solution that maintaining consistent pressure is nearly impossible. Third, your back is going to be screaming within an hour because this position leaning over a slanted surface, applying force downward, is biomechanically brutal. Raoul watches your first few attempts, makes a non-committal grunt, and adjusts your hand position. You'll build the muscles, he says, which is not particularly encouraging when those muscles are currently trembling. But then, suddenly, you get it right. The blade catches properly, and a whole sheet of hair and epidermis peels away beneath it, sliding down the hide like disgusting snow. It's satisfying in a deeply gross way, like popping a massive pimple or peeling dried glue off your hands, except this is dead animal tissue and your whole body is involved. You fall into the rhythm. Scrape, squeegee, scrape, squeegee. Reposition the hide. Scrape again. The pile of limed hair and tissue at your feet grows larger. Your shoulders burn. The caustic lime solution splashes onto your forearms despite your best efforts, leaving red, irritated patches that will itch for days. This is just the hair side, Raoul informs you cheerfully. Once that's done, you flip the hide and scrape the flesh side to remove any remaining fat, connective tissue, and meat scraps that the butcher missed. The flesh side is somehow worse. The butchers of medieval towns did a decent job of removing most of the usable meat. Protein was too valuable to waste, but they weren't precious about it. They left plenty behind, and after 9 days in the lime pit, that residual flesh has turned into a gray, partially dissolved slime that smells like death having a particularly bad day. You scrape and scrape, and the knife pushes off chunks of fatty tissue, thin membranes, and stringy bits that you can't quite identify. Historians still argue whether medieval butchers deliberately left some flesh on hides as a kind of job security measure, making tanners dependent on a messy product, or if the technology of the era just made clean flensing impossible. Either way, you're now intimately familiar with the subcutaneous layer of cow anatomy, and you'll never look at a leather jacket the same way again. Pierre is working next to you on another hide, moving with the easy confidence of someone who's been doing this for 2 years. He's maybe 13, and his arms are ropey with developing muscle from this exact motion, repeated thousands of times. You get used to the smell, he offers, probably noticing your periodic grimaces. After a while, you only really notice it when you leave and come back. This is the same thing Guillaume said, and you're starting to suspect it's the Tannery equivalent of "the customer is always right," a polite fiction everyone repeats to get through the day. The truth is, you never fully adjust to working in an environment that assaults every sense simultaneously. You just get better at dissociating from your body, at existing in a kind of numb autopilot where your hands keep working while your consciousness retreats somewhere else. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that doesn't make it into most textbooks. The hair and wool scraped from hides wasn't waste, it was a valuable byproduct. Limed hair could be washed, dried, and mixed with clay and straw to make a kind of primitive mortar for filling cracks in walls. It could also be felted into rough textiles or used as stuffing for mattresses, though you'd want to be absolutely sure it was thoroughly cleaned first. Some tanners sold their hair waste to plasterers and builders, creating a secondary income stream from what would otherwise be garbage. It's a perfect example of medieval circular economy principles. In a pre-industrial world where producing anything required enormous labor, you monetized every possible output. The pile of hair at your feet represents maybe a few pennies of additional income, enough to buy bread for the apprentice's dinner. After 40 minutes of scraping, which feels like 4 hours, your hide is finally clean, or at least clean by medieval standards. Both sides are pale and smooth, free of hair and obvious tissue, though they're still grotesquely swollen and slimy with residual lime solution. Raoul inspects your work with the critical eye of someone who knows exactly how this hide will perform in 6 months. and he points out a few spots you missed on the edges. You scrape those clean, and he nods approval. Not bad for a first-timer, he offers, which might be the warmest compliment you'll receive all day. The hide gets carried to a rinsing trough, a long stone channel with fresh water running through it where it'll soak for a few hours to remove the excess lime before moving to the next stage. You're 2 hides into your workday, and it's not even mid-morning yet. Your back aches, your arms are covered in lime burns, and your clothes are soaked with a combination of water and dissolved animal tissue. Master Guillaume appears with a wooden cup of small beer weak, slightly fermented because clean water is a luxury in medieval Townsend you drink gratefully, trying not to think about the fact that your hands have been elbow-deep in caustic hide solution. This is what passes for a break in the tannery. 30 seconds of standing still while you rehydrate before returning to the beam for the next hide. There are 6 more hides in that lime pit alone, and 3 other pits are due to be checked today. You're beginning to understand why tanner families were multi-generational operations. You needed children to replenish the workforce as older workers' bodies gave out. The beam house contains a dozen hides in various stages of scraping, and the floor is a slurry of hair, tissue, and lime water that squishes beneath your feet. One of the apprentices is responsible for periodically shoveling this mess into buckets and dumping it into a dedicated waste pit at the property's edge, where it will slowly decompose and eventually get spread on fields as fertilizer. Medieval agriculture ran on these kinds of unappetizing inputs: human and animal waste, butchery scraps, tannery sludge, all carefully recycled because synthetic fertilizers wouldn't exist for another 6 centuries. The whole system was impressively sustainable from an ecological standpoint, even if it was nightmarish from a sensory perspective. Between hides, Guillaume explains the science of what's happening, though obviously he doesn't use terms like collagen protein structure or alkaline hydrolysis. He explains it in practical, empirical terms. The lime opens up the hide, makes it swell and soften so the tanning liquor can penetrate later. But you must be careful. Too long in the lime and the hide becomes weak, will tear when you try to work it. Not long enough and it stays tight and stiff, won't take the tanning properly. This is generational wisdom encoded in folk language, the result of centuries of trial and error by people who understood causation even if they couldn't explain mechanism. Medieval craftspeople were brilliant empiricists, carefully observing cause and effect relationships and passing down techniques that worked, even if the underlying chemistry remained mysterious. You move on to the next hide, and this time your technique is marginally better. The scraping knife feels slightly less foreign in your hands, and you're learning to read the hide surface, to see where the hair is ready to release and where it needs more pressure. This is skilled labor. You realize, even though everything about the environment screams unskilled grunt work, there's judgment and expertise required at every step, the kind of tacit knowledge that takes years to develop and can't be easily transferred through written instructions. This is why medieval guilds were so protective of their techniques, why apprenticeships lasted 7 years, why journeymen had to produce a masterpiece to prove their competence before opening their own shops. You couldn't learn this from a book, even if books existed in sufficient quantity, because so much of the craft lived in muscle memory and experiential understanding. The morning grinds forward. You scrape hide after hide, falling into a kind of exhausted rhythm where thought becomes unnecessary and you're just a machine that drags blades across dead animal skin. The sun climbs higher, and the beam house gets progressively hotter and more humid, the steam rising from the hides mixing with your sweat and the ambient moisture of the lime pits. Pierre tells you that summer is worse, the heat makes everything smell more intense, and the flies become unbearable, landing on the hides and your face and your food with democratic disgust. At least November offers cool relief, even if your wet clothes and open-sided workspace mean you're perpetually chilled underneath the surface sweat. By the time Guillaume calls for the midday break, you've processed 8 hides through various stages of scraping. Your back feels like someone has beaten it with clubs. Your hands are cramping around the knife handles, and you've developed a repetitive strain headache from the constant forward-leaning posture. The apprentices gather in the main workshop for dinner bread, cheese, onions, and more small beer, and you join them, too exhausted to care any more about the state of your hands as you tear into the loaf. They're joking among themselves in rapid French, teasing Pierre about a girl he likes in town. And for a moment it feels almost normal, almost like any other medieval workplace. Then you catch a whiff of yourself and remember that you smell like you've been marinating in a combination of wet dog, ammonia, and decay, and that normal people are having their midday meals in environments that don't make their eyes water. The afternoon promises more of the same, but Guillaume has mercy and assigns you to a less physically demanding task. You'll be monitoring the other lime pits, checking hides for readiness, and occasionally stirring the pits to keep the solution uniform. It's still grossier, still dealing with caustic chemicals and decomposing animal materials, but at least your back gets a break. As you walk toward the pit area, the enormity of the operation settles over you. This is just one tannery in one town, and it's processing hundreds of hides per year. Multiply that across every town in Europe, and you begin to understand the sheer scale of the medieval leather industry. Every shoe, every glove, every bound book required this exact process, this same sequence of disgusting, labor-intensive steps. The infrastructure of medieval civilization was built on the backs of people willing to do work that literally no one else could stomach, and their reward was social stigma and respiratory disease. You're 2 hours into your tannery career, and you've already learned more about hide processing than any modern person needs to know. But you're nowhere near finished. The liming and scraping are just the beginning, the preliminary steps that prepare the hide for the real transformation ahead. Master Guillaume is heading toward a different section of the compound now, where the smell somehow shifts into an even more aggressive register. You follow, aprons still dripping with lime water, hands already accepting that clean is a relative concept you've left behind in the world outside these gates. The smell changes as you approach the next work area, which is genuinely impressive considering what you've already endured. The sharp alkaline burn of the lime pits gives way to something organic and aggressively biological, a thick, ammonia-rich stench that makes your sinuses feel like they're being scrubbed with steel wool. Master Guillaume leads you toward a cluster of wooden vats, each maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet across, and even from 10 paces away you can see vapor rising from their surfaces. The baiting vats, he announces with the tone of someone introducing a difficult relative at a family gathering. You'll want to breathe shallow here. This advice is rapidly becoming the tannery's unofficial motto, and you're starting to suspect that breathe shallow is actually code for this will be worse than you think. You peer into the first vat, and the liquid inside is a murky yellowish brown, like tea that's gone terribly wrong. Something about the color and the smell triggers a deep recognition in your brain, some primal warning system that predates language. Guillaume confirms your worst suspicions. Urine, he says simply, mostly human, some animal. We collect it from the town, age it here for a few weeks until it's properly fermented. You're staring at approximately 200 gallons of aged human piss, and you're expected to work with it. The medieval leather industry ran on bodily waste in ways that would make a modern OSHA inspector weep into their clipboard, and you're about to get intimately familiar with exactly why tanners were banned from living within city walls in most European municipalities. The urine collection system was actually sophisticated in its own disgusting way. Guillaume's Tannery maintains contracts with several taverns and public houses in town, where large clay vessels sit outside the doors for patrons to use. Every few days, a tanner's cart makes the rounds, collecting these vessels and delivering them to the workshop. You're paid a few pennies for your urine, which meant the poorest residents had a way to generate tiny amounts of income from something they were producing anyway. Some tanners also kept the collection pots near their own workshops for passers-by to use, essentially operating public toilets that doubled as raw material gathering stations. The system was efficient, hygienic by medieval standards, and absolutely revolting by any objective measure. But here's the thing, urine actually works. As it ages and bacteria break down the urea, it produces ammonia-powerful alkaline compound that continues the dehairing and softening process that the lime pits began. The ammonia also helps neutralize some of the remaining lime in the hides, bringing them closer to a neutral pH and making them more receptive to the tanning agents that come later. Medieval tanners didn't understand the chemistry in modern terms, but they understood causation perfectly. They knew that hides soaked in aged urine came out softer and more pliable than hides that skipped this step. They knew that fresher urine didn't work as well as urine that had been fermenting for weeks. They'd figured all this out through empirical observation, probably over centuries of trial and error, and they'd built an entire collection and processing infrastructure around human waste. Pierre is already working at one of the vats, using a long wooden paddle to stir the contents. Submerged beneath the surface, you can just make out several hides, pale shapes undulating in the murky liquid like drowned ghosts. He's been stirring for 10 minutes, he tells you, and he'll continue for another 10 to ensure the hides are evenly exposed to the urine. Then they'll soak undisturbed for 2 days before being pulled out, rinsed, and moved to the next stage. You watch him work, noting how he's positioned himself upwind of the vat and how he's breathing through his mouth in short, careful sips of air. This is wisdom earned through experience. You can't avoid the smell entirely, but you can minimize your exposure through strategic positioning and breathing technique. Guillaume hands you a paddle and gestures toward an adjacent vat. Your turn, he says, and there's something almost ceremonial about this moment, like a terrible initiation rite. You take the paddle smooth from years of use, stained the color of old amber, and you lower it into the liquid. The resistance is immediate and wrong. The fermented urine has a viscosity that's thicker than water, almost syrupy, and as you stir, you can feel the submerged hides shifting beneath your paddle like sleeping animals. The smell intensifies with the motion, waves of ammonia vapor rolling up from the disturbed surface, and your eyes immediately begin streaming tears. This is a chemical reaction, not emotion, you tell yourself. Your body is responding to irritants, but it definitely feels like crying. We call this baiting, Guillaume explains, using the old French term batterie, which means to beat or work. It softens the hide further, opens the grain structure so the tanning liquors can penetrate evenly. Without baiting, you get stiff, uneven leather that cracks and fails. You stir mechanically, trying to think about anything other than what you're doing. The paddle makes slow circles in the vat, occasionally bumping against a hide with a soft, sickening thud. Historians still argue whether the term baiting originally referred to the stirring motion or to the beating action of the ammonia on the hide structure. But frankly, etymology is the last thing on your mind right now. You're just trying not to gag as another wave of urine vapor washes over your face. Here's a quirky historical detail that somehow makes this worse. In some regions, tanners had ranking systems for their urine based on its source. Urine from heavy drinkers, which was more dilute, was considered less valuable than urine from relatively sober individuals. There are documented cases of tanners paying slightly more for piss from monasteries, under the theory that monks' more regulated diets produced more consistent ammonia levels. This meant medieval monks were literally selling their urine to tanners, which is not typically mentioned in romantic histories of monastery life. The attention to detail in medieval crafts extended even to quality grading human waste products. Because when your entire profession depends on biochemical processes you don't fully understand, you track every variable you can identify. After 15 minutes of stirring, which feels like an hour, your arms are trembling and your respiratory system has staged a full revolt against your life choices. Guillaume finally tells you to stop, and you extract the paddle with relief, letting it rest against the vat's edge. The liquid streams off the wood in thick droplets, and you notice your hands and forearms are now damp with splashback. The ammonia is strong enough that you can feel it tingling on your skin, not quite burning but definitely making its presence known. You'll wash later, Guillaume assures you, but there's no point washing between tasks when you're just going to get filthy again in 5 minutes. This is Tannery logic, and it's as sound as it is depressing. The baiting vats are positioned near another set of pits, and as you walk over to inspect them, you notice these ones smell different, less ammonia sharp, more organic and fecal. Your heart sinks because you know what's coming before Guillaume even explains. The dung pits, he says, confirming your fears. This is where we use the droppings, mostly from dogs, sometimes from chickens or pigeons. The enzymes in the dung continue the baiting process, give us even finer control over the leather's final texture. You're staring at pits full of water mixed with dog shit, and you're expected to submerge hides in them. The medieval leather industry had identified enzymatic action trypsin and other proteases from animal digestive system centuries before anyone understood what enzymes were, and they'd learned to harness these biological processes through the elegant solution of soaking hides in excrement. This explains the dogs you saw earlier, the half-feral pack that Guillaume keeps fed and semi-domesticated. Every few days, someone collects their droppings from around the compound, brings them to the baiting area, and mixes them with water to create what tanners called pure or pure, from the Latin word for boy, though some scholars think it might derive from the word for pure in the sense of carefully processed. Either etymology is somewhat ironic given that you're making processed dog shit soup. The droppings get aged for a few days, allowing bacteria to begin breaking them down, and then hides are submerged in this mixture for anywhere from a few hours to 2 days, depending on the desired softness of the final leather. Pierre is checking one of the dung pits now, using a hooked pole to lift a hide to the surface and examining its texture. The hide is noticeably softer than the ones you scraped earlier, more pliable and less swollen. The dung treatment is working, breaking down residual proteins and lipids, modifying the collagen structure in ways that make the leather more workable. It's genuinely impressive biochemistry, accomplished entirely without understanding the underlying mechanisms. Medieval tanners were practical scientists, running experiments across generations, carefully noting which variables produced which results, and encoding successful techniques in tradition and guild knowledge. The fact that their laboratory smelled like an open sewer doesn't diminish the sophistication of their empirical method. You help Pierre extract the hide from the dung pit, both of you gripping the slippery mass and hauling it toward the rinsing troughs. The hide is covered in a thin film of fecal matter, and your hands are now directly contaminated with processed dog shit. This is your life now. This is what you're doing on this medieval afternoon. The hide goes into the trough where fresh stream water runs over it, gradually washing away the visible residue, though the smell lingers in a way that suggests it's permeated the hide structure at a molecular level. After 20 minutes of rinsing and occasional scrubbing with coarse cloths, the hide is declared clean enough to move forward. You're learning that clean in the tannery context is wildly different from clean in any other context you've previously encountered. The combination of lime pits, urine vats, and dung pits represents what tanners called the baiting sequence, a carefully orchestrated progression of chemical and biological treatments that transformed raw hide into something capable of accepting tanning agents. Each step had to be executed properly or the entire hide could be ruined. Too long in the lime and the hide dissolved. Too long in the urine and it became spongy and weak. Too aggressive with the dung treatment and the hide turned to mush. Master Guillaume and his journeymen were constantly monitoring dozens of hides in various stages, tracking timing in their heads or with marks on a wooden tally stick, making judgment calls about when to move each hide to the next stage. It was complex project management accomplished without spreadsheets or written schedules, just experience and attention. By mid-afternoon, you've stirred 4 different vats, checked 6 dung pits, and helped rinse a dozen hides. Your clothes are soaked with a mixture of water, urine, lime solution, and fecal matter. You smell like a combination of a public latrine and a wet dog that died in an ammonia factory. Your hands are raw from the caustic liquids and rough hide surfaces. Your back still aches from the morning's scraping work. And you're not even halfway through a normal workday. The apprentices are still moving with purpose, though even they look tired. And you notice Pierre occasionally rubbing his lower back when he thinks no one is watching. This is their normal, the baseline of their existence, and they'll do this 6 days a week for 7 years before they're even considered trained. There's a brutal honesty to the work that's almost refreshing in its awfulness. No one pretends this is pleasant or dignified or anything other than exactly what it is. Disgusting, physically demanding labor that has to be done because society needs leather. Master Guillaume doesn't dress it up with euphemisms or try to convince you that there's nobility in suffering. He just explains each step matter-of-factly, demonstrates the technique, and expects you to do it properly. The medieval world didn't have much patience for squeamishness because survival required doing many unpleasant things, and someone had to do them. The tanners accepted this role, extracted what economic benefit they could from it, and built communities around their shared exclusion from polite society. You're taking a brief water break standing in the one corner of the compound that gets a cross breeze, trying to air out your soaked clothes when one of the town's leather merchants arrives. He's dressed well, definitely a middle-class tradesman, and he picks his way through the tannery grounds like someone navigating a minefield, clearly trying to minimize contact with everything. He speaks with Guillaume briefly, examining some finished leather from a previous batch, and you can see the social hierarchy playing out in real time. The merchant is prosperous because he sells leather, but he's careful to maintain distance from the people who actually make it. Guillaume is deferential but not servilely, knows his craft is essential and his prices are fair. They negotiate briefly and settle on terms for a future delivery. The merchant leaves quickly, and you notice he walks upwind the entire way back to his horse. "He'll sell that leather in town for 3 times what he pays me," Guillaume observes without apparent bitterness. He takes no risk, does no work, and earns the larger share. But he also doesn't smell like this. It's a practical acknowledgement of economic reality. The social stigma of tanning meant that tanners could never directly access the most profitable markets. They needed intermediaries, merchants who could enter respectable shops and negotiate with guild masters and wealthy clients without triggering the automatic disgust response that tanners provoked. This middleman system extracted value at every step, but it was necessary because medieval social boundaries were more rigid than medieval guild regulations. The afternoon light is starting to slant lower, and Guillaume announces that you'll spend the final hours of the workday preparing new batches of baiting liquor. This involves collecting fresh urine from the holding vessels that arrived this morning and transferring it to aging barrels, then mixing a new batch of dung solution using droppings collected from around the compound. This grunt work with no skill required, which makes it perfect for exhausted newcomers and young apprentices. You and Pierre work together, hauling buckets of urine from the collection cart to the storage barrels, trying not to slosh too much on yourselves and failing regularly. The urine is still relatively fresh, only a day or two old, so it smells more like a public urinal than the aged ammonia-rich stuff in the vats, which is somehow worse because it's more recognizable. Pierre tells you stories while you work, partly to distract from the task and partly because he's lonely and you're a new audience. He's been apprenticed here since he was 11, sent by his father who was also a tanner in a smaller village. He'll finish his term in 5 more years, and if he saves enough money, he hopes to open his own small workshop, maybe marry a girl from another tanning family. His ambitions are modest because they have to be social mobility from the tanning profession was nearly impossible. But within the constraints of his situation, he's building a life plan, and there's something admirable about his pragmatism. He knows exactly how bad this work is, and he's doing it anyway because the alternatives are worse. Agricultural labor that pays nothing, or vagrancy and starvation. As the sun approaches the horizon, Guillaume finally calls an end to the workday. The apprentices secure the vats, check that all the pits are properly covered against rain and scavenging animals, and gather their tools. There's a communal washing station near the stream where everyone rinses their hands and arms, scrubbing with coarse soap that's probably made from tallow and wood ash. You scrub until your skin is red, and you still smell like the tannery. Guillaume was right earlier, the smell has permeated your clothes, your hair, probably your skin at a cellular level. You'll carry it with you wherever you go tonight, a fragrant badge of your day's labor. The apprentices head to their loft, where they'll eat a simple supper and collapse onto their pallets. Guillaume offers you a cup of wine better quality than the small beer, kept for guests and special occasions, and you sit for a moment in the growing twilight. The compound is quieter now, just the sound of water running in the troughs and the occasional shift of a hide settling in its vat. You did well, Guillaume says, and you think he might actually mean it. Most visitors don't make it past the lime pits before they're vomiting in the bushes. You lasted the full day. It's probably the kindest compliment you've received while covered head to toe in a mixture of urine and fecal matter. You leave the tannery as darkness falls, and the smell follows you like a loyal dog. Tomorrow, there will be more hides to process, more vats to stir, more disgusting biological processes to facilitate. This will continue for months and years, An endless cycle of transformation that turns dead animal skins into one of civilization's most essential materials. You've survived your first day, but you're beginning to understand why Tanner families stayed Tanner families. Once you'd accepted this life, once you'd internalized the smell and the social stigma and the physical toll, there was nowhere else to go. You were marked, literally and figuratively, as someone who worked with waste and death to create utility. And medieval society needed that utility desperately, even as it shunned the people who provided it. Morning arrives too early, and you're back at the tannery gates before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Apparently hauling waterlogged hides uses muscle groups that modern life leaves blissfully dormant. The smell hits you again as you approach, though there's a weird moment where your brain almost recognizes it as familiar before your gag reflex reminds you that familiarity doesn't equal acceptability. Master Guillaume is already moving through the compound with a lit lantern, checking on the overnight soaking pits, and he nods as you arrive. The baiting continues today, he announces, and your heart sinks a little because you were hoping yesterday's urine and feces immersion was a one-time orientation hazing. Apparently not, but today you're moving beyond simple stirring. Today you're going to learn about puring, in detail the art and science of enzymatic baiting using carefully prepared dung solutions. Guillaume leads you to a work area you didn't explore yesterday, a semi-enclosed shed where buckets of dog droppings sit in various stages of processing. The smell here is concentrated and specific, cutting through even the tannery's general miasma with fecal precision. We collect these daily, Guillaume explains, gesturing at the buckets. Fresh droppings from the dogs, sometimes mixed with chicken or pigeon dung if we need more volume. The secret is in how you prepare them. The preparation process is more complex than you'd expect for something that starts as dog shit. The droppings can't be used completely fresh. They need to age for 2 to 3 days, allowing bacterial action to begin breaking them down and activating the enzymatic content. But they can't be too old either, or the enzymes degrade and lose effectiveness. Guillaume's family has determined through generations of practice that droppings aged for exactly 2.5 days produce the best results for their typical leather products. This isn't written down anywhere. It's knowledge that lives in Guillaume's head, passed from his father, who learned from his father. If Guillaume died tomorrow without teaching his apprentices, this specific timing knowledge would die with him. You watch as Raoul, the senior journeyman, prepares a fresh batch of puring solution. He takes a bucket of appropriately aged droppings. You cannot believe you just thought the phrase, appropriately aged droppings, without irony, and begins breaking them up in a large wooden trough, adding water gradually as he works. The ratio matters enormously. Too concentrated and the enzymes work too aggressively, turning the hide into mush. Too dilute and nothing happens. You've wasted time and the hide remains stiff. Raoul uses his hands for this work, kneading the mixture like dough, breaking up clumps and ensuring even distribution. His hands are stained a permanent brown that no amount of scrubbing will remove, the mark of his profession literally embedded in his skin. The consistency should be like thin porridge, Raoul explains, demonstrating by lifting a handful and letting it drip back into the trough. You should be able to pour it, but it should have body, suspension. If it's too watery, the dung settles to the bottom and the hides don't get proper exposure. This is sophisticated process control accomplished through sensory evaluation sight, touch, and yes, smell. He's assessing viscosity, particle suspension, and enzymatic readiness using nothing but his experienced judgment. Modern tanneries would use pH meters, enzyme concentration tests, and standardized mixing ratios. Raoul uses his hands and his nose and 2 decades of practice. Here's the thing about medieval craftsmanship that doesn't come across in museum displays or historical romances. It was actually really good. The tanners of the 13th century produced leather that was durable, flexible, and beautiful when finished. Military historians have documented medieval leather armor that remained functional for decades. Book conservators work with medieval leather bindings that have survived 700 years in remarkable condition. This quality didn't come from advanced technology or chemical understanding. It came from meticulous attention to detail at every stage. From people like Raoul, who could assess dung water consistency by feel and knew exactly how that would affect the final product. The knowledge was empirical and experiential, but it was real knowledge, and it worked. You're handed a bucket and told to prepare your own puring solution under Raoul's supervision. You reach into the aged droppings, dry on the outside, moist inside, crumbly and disturbingly warm from bacterial activity, and you begin breaking them up in the trough. The texture is unforgettable. It's not quite solid and not quite liquid, something in between, and it sticks to your hands in a way that makes your skin crawl. You add water, add more water, and gradually the mixture becomes more uniform. Raoul watches critically, occasionally reaching in to check your consistency, nodding or shaking his head. More water, he says once, and then 5 minutes later, good, that's the right texture. The science behind this process is actually fascinating, though Guillaume and Raoul would never describe it this way. Dog feces contains digestive enzymes, primarily trypsin, lipase, and amylase that survive passage through the digestive tract. When you create a water suspension of feces, you're essentially creating an enzyme bath. These enzymes continue breaking down proteins and fats in the hide, targeting specific molecular bonds in the collagen structure. The result is leather with a softer, more pliable texture, especially useful for products that need to flex repeatedly like shoe uppers or book bindings. Different animals' droppings have different enzymatic profiles, which is why tanners experimented with various sources. Dog dung became the standard because dogs are carnivorous and their digestive enzymes are particularly effective on animal proteins. Historians still argue whether medieval tanners recognized they were using different types of dung for different purposes, or if they just noticed that dog dung makes softer leather than cow dung, without understanding why. The evidence suggests they were keenly aware of differences even if they couldn't explain mechanisms. There are surviving guild regulations from various European cities that specify which types of dung are acceptable for different leather grades. Some high-end leather guilds required pure dog dung only, no mixing with chicken or pigeon droppings. This suggests quality control and standardization, which implies conscious understanding of variable effects. They were practical biochemists working with what they had. Once your puring solution is properly prepared, you help Raoul transfer it to one of the working pits. This involves bucket brigades. You fill a bucket from the trough, carry it to the pit, pour it in, return for more. It takes maybe 20 trips to fill a medium-sized pit to the proper depth, and by the time you're done, you're exhausted and thoroughly splashed with dung water. The physical labor of medieval crafts is easy to underestimate from historical accounts. The hides were placed in puring baths sounds simple in a history book. The reality is hundreds of pounds of liquid feces being manually transported one bucket at a time by people whose backs are already screaming from yesterday's work. Pierre arrives with a hide that's completed its urine betingets, been rinsed multiple times, and is ready for the next stage. Together, you lower it into the freshly filled puring pit, submerging it completely beneath the brown, cloudy liquid. The hide will stay here for exactly 18 hours. Guillaume tells you, not 16, not 20, 18. Pull it too early and the enzymatic action hasn't achieved sufficient softening. Leave it too late and you risk overbaiting, where the hide structure begins to break down too much and you get weak leather that will fail prematurely. Timing is everything, and medieval tanners tracked it using water clocks, candle clocks, or simply their experienced sense of day-night cycles. Guillaume knows exactly when each hide entered each pit, carrying this information in his head like a complex scheduling system. The morning progresses through more of the same, preparing baiting solutions, transferring hides between stages, constantly monitoring the various pits and vats. You're starting to see the tannery as a complex system with dozens of parallel processes running simultaneously, all requiring careful coordination. At any given moment, there might be 40 hides in various stages, 10 in lime pits, 12 in urine baiting, 8 in puring pits, 6 being scraped at the beam, and 4 in final rinsing before they move to actual tanning. Guillaume is essentially running a medieval production line, except instead of assembly stations, he's managing biochemical reactions that depend on timing, temperature, and environmental conditions he can barely control. Around mid-morning, you notice something new. One of the apprentices is working with a hide that looks different from the others. It's smaller, maybe from a calf or young cow, and it's being treated with unusual care. Guillaume sees you watching and explains. That's for a book commission, he says. The monastery has ordered vellum-quality leather for manuscript pages. It requires special processing, gentler baiting, more controlled timing, extra finishing steps. The monastery pays 3 times normal price, but the work is exacting. This is the premium end of the leather market, producing material for illuminated manuscripts and important documents. The same disgusting processes you've been experiencing for 2 days can, with enough skill and attention, produce surfaces smooth and pale enough for fine calligraphy and delicate illustrations. Here's a quirky historical detail. The finest vellum often came from stillborn or very young animals because their skin had finer grain structure and fewer imperfections. There was actually a market for these unfortunate casualties of medieval animal husbandry, and tanners would pay premium prices for unblemished young hides. The monastery vellum trade created an economic incentive structure where tanners maintained relationships with farmers and shepherds, essentially creating a futures market for fetal and neonatal animal skins. It's macabre from a modern perspective, but it was pragmatic medieval resource utilization. The animal was already dead. Might as well extract value from every part. You spend time helping with the special vellum hide, and the process is notably different from the standard leather production. Everything is gentler, shorter lime treatments, weaker baiting solutions, constant monitoring. The hide gets individual attention that bulk commercial leather never receives. This is artisanal production within an already skilled craft, mastery within mastery. The apprentice working on it is the most experienced, a 20-year-old named Thomas who's almost ready to become a journeyman. His hands move with practiced precision. His judgment calls about readiness and timing are confident. He represents 7 years of accumulated knowledge and muscle memory, and he can produce vellum that scribes will praise for its smoothness and durability. The afternoon brings a new task. cleaning the dung pits themselves. The enzymatic baiting process gradually depletes the active compounds in the fecal solution, and after a dozen hides have cycled through a pit, the mixture becomes less effective and needs replacing. This means you're going to shovel out used dung water and dispose of it in the waste area. The work is exactly as terrible as it sounds. You and Pierre work together with shovels and buckets, manually excavating the pit's contents. The depleted mixture is thicker than when it went in, loaded with particulates from the hides and broken down organic matter. It's heavy, sloshes. It smells like concentrated death, and it takes 2 hours to fully empty one pit. The worst part of the job, Pierre admits cheerfully, apparently unconcerned by the fact that he's knee-deep in a pit full of processed dog shit. We rotate this duty among the apprentices. Last week was Andre's turn. Next week will be Jean's. At least in winter, the smell is manageable. In July, people vomit. This is his life. This is normal for him. He's 14 years old, and he's developed a casual acceptance of standing in fecal matter as a regular work responsibility. You're having a difficult time processing the psychological adjustment required to reach this level of dissociation. How many times do you have to shovel shit before your brain just accepts it as unremarkable background activity? The waste from the pits gets dumped in a large depression at the property's edge, where it will slowly break down and eventually be sold to farmers as fertilizer. Nothing is wasted in the medieval economy, not even waste itself. The tanneries byproduct slimed hair, used dung solutions, scraps of flesh and fat all find secondary markets. Guillaume keeps careful mental accounts of these sales, supplementary income streams that mean the difference between moderate prosperity and genuine wealth. A successful tanner is partly craftsman and partly waste management entrepreneur, monetizing every output of their facility. By late afternoon, your body has moved beyond pain into a kind of numb acceptance. Your muscles ache. Your hands are raw. Your nose has given up trying to filter the smells and just lets everything through in an olfactory surrender. You've been soaked in urine, covered in feces, splashed with lime water, and physically exhausted by manual labor that never seems to end. And you're still not done. There are evening chores, pits to check, heights to rotate, countless small tasks that keep the operation running. Guillaume wasn't exaggerating when he said the work was endless. Hides don't stop processing just because humans are tired. The biochemical reactions continue day and night, and the tanners must attend them constantly. As the sun sets on your second day, you help cover the open pits against evening rain and secure the tools in the workshop. The apprentices are quieter tonight, too exhausted for the joking energy they had yesterday. You all gather for a brief supper bread, pottage thick with barley and onions, and the ever-present small beer. The food tastes like the tannery smells, not because it's contaminated, but because your senses are so overwhelmed that everything has merged into one undifferentiated experience of medieval leather production. You eat mechanically, grateful for calories, too tired to care about flavor. Master Guillaume sits with his wine again, and tonight he's more philosophical. People think we're cursed, he says quietly. They cross themselves when we walk through town markets. They say we're unclean, spiritually tainted by working with death and waste. Maybe they're right, but without us, they'd have no shoes, no book covers, no sword belts, no buckets. Civilization runs on leather, and leather requires this. He gestures at the compound around you, the stained ground, the vat clusters, the drying racks waiting for tomorrow's work. Someone must do it. My family has done it for 3 generations. My sons will do it after me. We're tanners. This is what we are. You leave the tannery for the second night, and the smell is so deeply embedded in your clothes and hair that you barely notice it anymore. Pierre was right, you do stop noticing it. Not because it disappears, but because your brain stops trying to process it as novel information. It becomes background noise, ambient reality, just part of being alive in this particular time and place. You've crossed some threshold in these 2 days, gone from visitor to participant in one of medieval society's most essential and reviled professions. Tomorrow there will be more hides, more pits, more endless cycles of soaking and scraping and monitoring. But tonight, you finally understand what Guillaume meant about getting used to the work. You don't really get used to it. You just stop expecting anything different. Your third morning begins with pain radiating from your lower back and a smell in your nostrils that won't leave even after you've washed 3 times in cold water. You're learning what medieval workers knew instinctively. The body adapts to brutal labor through a combination of strengthening and strategic numbness, both physical and psychological. Master Guillaume greets you at the gates with unexpected news today. You'll be working the lime pits directly, which means handling the most caustic and dangerous substances in the entire tannery. The lime needs refreshing in 2 pits. He explains. Old solution gets weak, stops working properly. We drain it, mix fresh quicklime, start again. Your hands instinctively clench at the mention of quicklime, remembering the chemical burns from just splashing lime water on your arms 2 days ago. Quicklime calcium oxide arrives at the tannery in large clay vessels sealed with wax. The material looks innocuous enough, a grayish-white powder that could be mistaken for flour or ash. But Guillaume handles the vessels with obvious respect, keeping them covered and away from any moisture. Quicklime and water react violently. He warns, the mixture can boil, splash, blind you if it hits your eyes. We add the lime to water slowly, never the reverse, and we stand upwind of the pit while mixing. This is practical chemistry encoded in safety rules, knowledge purchased through accidents and injuries across generations. Medieval tanners understood exothermic reactions without knowing the term. They just knew that certain mixing procedures resulted in burns and blindness, so you followed the safer approach. You watch Raoul prepare for the lime mixing with the deliberate care of someone handling explosives. He ties a cloth across his face, covering his nose and mouth. He rolls his sleeves down and secures them at the wrists despite the warm morning. He positions himself upwind of the empty pit, with a clear path to the washing trough if something goes wrong. These are the safety protocols of medieval industrial regulatory agencies. No written standards, just practical wisdom that kept you alive if you paid attention. The apprentices who survived to become journeymen were the ones who watched carefully and followed the unwritten rules. The ones who didn't pay attention ended up scarred, blinded, or dead. The pit itself is maybe 5 feet deep and 8 feet across, lined with fitted stones that have been sealed with clay to prevent leakage. Raoul fills it halfway with water from the stream, using buckets to carefully control the level. Then he opens a quicklime vessel and begins adding the powder to the water, 1 small scoop at a time. Each addition produces an immediate reaction. The water hisses and steams, the temperature spikes, and bubbles rise to the surface as the calcium oxide becomes calcium hydroxide, releasing enormous heat. The pit literally begins to boil in spots, vapor rising in thick clouds that smell sharp and chemical. Raoul continues adding lime steadily, stirring with a long wooden paddle between additions, his movements practiced and deliberate. Too much lime too fast and the boiling can splash out of the pit. Guillaume explains from a safe distance. I watched an apprentice lose vision in one eye that way. 20 years ago, he added half a bucket of lime at once, and the splash caught his face before he could react. The lime burned through to the bone before we could wash it off. This casual mention of maiming as a teaching moment is characteristic of medieval workplace culture. Accidents happened, people were permanently injured, and the work continued because there was no workers' compensation, no safety net, no alternative employment. You either learned to work safely or you suffered the consequences, and those consequences were often catastrophic and permanent. The chemical process occurring in the pit is actually elegant from a modern chemistry perspective. Calcium oxide reacts with water to form calcium hydroxide while releasing about 65 kilojoules per mole of energy. This heat is what makes the mixture dangerous, but also useful. The hot alkaline solution is more effective at breaking down the proteins and lipids in animal hides. The calcium hydroxide dissociates in water to produce hydroxide ions, creating a strongly basic solution with a pH around 12 to 13. This alkalinity is what loosens hair follicles, saponifies fats, and swells the collagen fibers. Medieval tanners didn't know about pH or hydroxide ions, but they knew exactly how much lime produced solutions that worked without destroying the hides, and they'd calibrated their recipes through endless empirical testing. Once the lime is fully dissolved and the violent boiling has subsided, Raoul lets the mixture cool for several hours before adding any hides. Fresh lime solution is too aggressive. It will chemically burn the hide surface and create uneven damage. The cooling period allows the reaction to complete and the temperature to drop to manageable levels. We test with our hands. Raoul explains, demonstrating by briefly dipping his fingertips into the solution and quickly withdrawing them. If it feels warm but not hot, and if the tingle on your skin is strong but bearable, it's ready. This is human skin being used as a crude thermometer and pH indicator, because medieval tanners didn't have instruments. They had their bodies and their experience, and they learned through painful trial and error exactly what strong but bearable felt like. Your job today is to help transfer hides into the newly prepared lime pit. These are fresh hides, just arrived from yesterday's slaughter, already cleaned of the worst blood and dirt. You and Pierre work together to unfold each hide. They arrive salted and folded to preserve them during transport and carry them to the pit's edge. Each hide is awkward and heavy, maybe 70 or 80 pounds, and maneuvering them requires coordination. You lower the first one into the lime solution, and it immediately begins to float, the hide's natural oils and trapped air keeping it on the surface. Pierre uses a weighted pole to push it fully under, ensuring complete submersion. The lime water soaks into the hide structure, beginning the transformation that will take 9 or 10 days to complete. Here's something that doesn't make it into most historical accounts. The lime pits were genuinely dangerous in ways beyond chemical burns. Medieval tanners occasionally drowned in lime pits, usually through accidents where someone slipped on the wet stone edges and fell in. The lime solution was heavy enough to make swimming difficult, and the chemical immediately began burning any exposed skin, causing panic. There are documented cases from guild records of tanners pulling colleagues from lime pits, only to discover the victim had inhaled lime solution and died from chemical burns to the lungs. The work was hazardous in ways that modern occupational safety regulations would never tolerate, but medieval workers had no choice but to accept these risks as the price of employment. Between hides, Guillaume shows you how to test the lime solution strength. He takes a handful of hair saved from yesterday's beam work and drops it into the pit. Watch how quickly it dissolves. He instructs. If the hair breaks down in less than a minute, the solution is good. If it takes longer, we need to add more lime. If it dissolves instantly, the mix is too strong and we need to dilute it. This is another example of empirical testing using available materials. The hair test worked because hair is primarily keratin protein, and strong alkaline solutions break keratin bonds. The speed of dissolution correlates roughly with solution strength, giving tanners a practical way to assess their chemistry without any understanding of molecular structure or reaction kinetics. The morning continues with more lime pit maintenance, checking pH through finger dipping, testing strength with hair samples, adjusting solutions by adding water or more lime as needed. It's meticulous work that requires constant attention, because lime's solution strength directly determines leather quality. Too weak and the hides don't process properly, remaining stiff and retaining hair. Too strong and the hides begin to dissolve, the collagen structure breaking down irreversibly. Guillaume makes these adjustments based on feel and experience, tiny calibrations that reflect decades of accumulated knowledge. He's essentially a wet lab chemist working without instruments, using his senses to maintain process parameters within acceptable ranges. Historians still argue whether medieval craft knowledge should be considered scientific in any meaningful sense. Some scholars claim it was purely empirical and lacked the theoretical framework necessary for science. Others argue that systematic observation, hypothesis testing through trial and error, and the accumulation of reproducible techniques absolutely constitute scientific method, even if the practitioners couldn't articulate underlying principles. Watching Guillaume work, you're inclined toward the latter interpretation. He's not just following rote traditions, constantly observing, adjusting, predicting outcomes based on current conditions. When he says, "This hide will need an extra day in the lime because the weather has been cold and the reaction proceeds more slowly," he's demonstrating causal reasoning and environmental sensitivity that seems fundamentally scientific, even if he'd never used that word. Around midday, disaster nearly strikes. One of the younger apprentices, a 12-year-old named Jean, is helping to stir a lime pit when his foot slips on the wet stone edge. He windmills his arms, desperately trying to regain balance, and for a horrible moment he's tilting forward toward the caustic solution. Raoul moves with surprising speed, grabbing Jean's tunic and hauling him backward. They both collapse onto the ground several feet from the pit, breathing hard. Guillaume appears instantly, checking Jean for any splashes of lime water, finding nothing. "That's why we always work in pairs at the lime pits," he says, his voice steady but tight with the tension of a near miss. "Jean, you're done here for today. Go help Thomas with the vellum hide." Jean scrambles away, visibly shaken, and you realize how close you just came to witnessing a maiming or death. The incident casts a pall over the afternoon work, everyone moving a bit more carefully, paying extra attention to foot placement and hand positions. This is how medieval workers learned safety, through close calls and actual accidents, through watching colleagues get injured and absorbing the lessons. There were no training videos or safety orientations, just the constant awareness that this work could permanently damage you if you got careless. The older journeyman bore scars from their learning process. Raoul has puckered burn marks on both forearms. Guillaume is missing the tip of one finger from a scraping accident, and one of the apprentices has a milky blind spot in his left eye from a lime splash years ago. These injuries were the price of education in medieval crafts. By late afternoon, you've processed 6 new hides into lime pits, adjusted solutions in 3 existing pits, and pulled 2 hides that have completed their lime treatment for transfer to the beam house. Your hands are raw from lime exposure despite your attempts to minimize direct contact, and you've developed a persistent cough from breathing the alkaline vapors all day. This is normal, Guillaume assures you. The lime gets in your lungs, irritates the breathing passages. Some tanners develop permanent coughs, especially older ones who've worked lime pits for decades. You learn to live with it. He says this casually, describing chronic respiratory disease as an inevitable occupational hazard, because what's the alternative? Stop working and starve? The economic trap of medieval professions becomes clearer the longer you spend here. Guillaume is relatively prosperous by tanner standard. She owns his workshop, has steady contracts with leather merchants, employs multiple workers, but his prosperity is entirely dependent on continuing this brutal work. He can't retire early because there are no pensions or savings instruments that would support him. He can't switch professions because the social stigma of tanning makes him unemployable elsewhere, and he has no other skills. His children will become tanners because they're growing up in the tannery, learning the craft by default, and no other guild will accept apprentices with tanning family backgrounds. The work has trapped multiple generations, offering enough economic reward to survive but never enough freedom to escape. Here's a quirky detail about lime that medieval tanners understood intuitively. Aged lime solution works differently than fresh lime solution. The calcium hydroxide gradually absorbs carbon dioxide from the air, converting back to calcium carbonate, essentially limestone again, which precipitates out of solution and reduces the effective alkalinity. This means a lime pit strength gradually decreases over time, even without any hides in it. Tanners tracked this aging process through their testing methods, knowing that a pit mixed last week would be slightly weaker than a pit mixed yesterday. They compensated by adjusting soaking times. Older pits required longer immersion to achieve the same results. This was practical management of chemical degradation, accomplished entirely through observation and adaptation. As evening approaches, you help cover the lime pits against rain and debris. The covers are heavy wooden planks that fit snugly over each pit, keeping environmental contaminants out and preventing accidental falls during darkness. The tannery never fully sleeps. The hides continue soaking overnight. The chemical reactions proceed regardless of human rest, but the active work pauses until morning. The apprentices gather for their evening meal, and tonight the conversation is subdued. Everyone's still processing Jean's near accident. These close calls served as reminders of mortality in an era when workplace death was common and unremarkable from a legal or social perspective. You could die doing this work, and if you did, your family might receive some minimal compensation from the guild, but probably not. Life was precarious, and certain professions made it more precarious than others. You wash at the communal trough, scrubbing your lime-burned hands with harsh soap, knowing it won't really help. The chemical damage is done. Your skin is already starting to crack and peel where the calcium hydroxide penetrated. This is the tanner's mark, the permanent evidence of the trade written on your body. Guillaume's hands are leather-thick and covered with scars, the accumulated damage of 30 years working with caustic substances. You develop calluses, he says, noticing your inspection. Not just on your hands, psychological calluses too. You stop registering the pain as remarkable. It's just the baseline of existence. This is perhaps the most honest thing he's said about the profession. The work doesn't get easier, you just get harder, your body and mind adapting through damage and desensitization until you can function in conditions that would have broken you initially. The third day ends as the others have, with you leaving the compound exhausted, injured, and smelling like industrial chemistry from an era before protective equipment. But something has shifted. You're not just observing the work anymore, you're beginning to internalize its rhythms, understand its necessities, accept its compromises. This is what the medieval tanner's life felt like from the inside. Endless repetition of difficult tasks, constant exposure to hazards, gradual accumulation of damage, all in service of producing something civilization desperately needed. The lime pits will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, requiring attention and maintenance and human bodies willing to risk burns and respiratory disease for the economic security of steady employment. You're starting to understand why tanners accepted their social exclusion with grim resignation. When your survival depends on work that marks you as untouchable, you stop fighting the designation and just try to make the best living you can within those constraints. Day 4 begins with a shift in focusserie, finally moving beyond the preparatory stages to the actual tanning process itself. Master Guillaume leads you to a different section of the compound, where rows of deep pits stretch out like rectangular graves, each one filled with dark, reddish-brown liquid that looks like concentrated tea mixed with mud. The smell here is different from the sharp chemical assault of the lime pits or the biological aggression of the baiting vats. This is an earthy, tannic smell, almost pleasant by tannery standards, like wet bark and autumn leaves with an underlying note of leather that's recognizable even before you understand what you're smelling. The tanning pits, Guillaume announces with something approaching pride. This is where hide becomes leather. Everything before this was preparation. Everything after is finishing. But here this is the transformation. The liquid in these pits is tanning liquor, a complex infusion made primarily from oak bark but also containing other plant materials rich in tannins. Guillaume walks you to the preparation area, where massive piles of shredded bark sit under a covered shed, protected from rain. We buy this from woodcutters and charcoal burners. He explains. Oak bark. Mostly, because English oak has high tannin content. But we also use chestnut bark, willow, sometimes spruce or hemlock depending on what's available and what we can afford. The bark arrives in rough chunks and needs to be shredded into smaller pieces to maximize surface area for extraction. This is accomplished through brutal manual labor. Apprentices spend hours pounding bark with wooden mallets, breaking it down into fibrous shreds that look like extremely unappetizing breakfast cereal. You're handed a mallet and shown the technique, which is exactly as straightforward and tedious as it sounds. You place bark chunks on a large stone surface and you pound them repeatedly until they fragment into smaller pieces. The work is monotonous, physically demanding, and produces a fine dust that gets into your lungs and makes you cough. Pierre works beside you, maintaining a steady rhythm that you try to match. Thwack, thwack, thwack. These sound echoes through the morning, punctuated by the occasional crack when a particularly resistant piece of bark finally yields. We need about 30 pounds of shredded bark for a full pit, Pierre tells you between strikes. Takes maybe 2 hours to prepare if you're working steadily. We do this twice a week usually, always keeping ahead of our needs. The economics of bark procurement reveal interesting details about medieval supply chains. Oak bark was a byproduct of timber production. When trees were felled for construction lumber or firewood, the bark was stripped off and sold separately. This created economic value from what would otherwise be waste, and it meant that tanning liquor prices correlated roughly with construction activity in the region. When towns were building churches or expanding walls, bark was plentiful and cheap. During economic downturns, when construction stalled, bark prices rose and tanners' profit margins suffered. Guillaume maintains relationships with several woodcutters and charcoal burners, securing favorable prices through long-term contracts and prompt payment. These business relationships are as essential to his operation as the physical infrastructure of pits and vats. Once you've shredded enough bark, Raoul shows you how to prepare the tanning liquor itself. The process is surprisingly similar to making tea, just on an industrial scale. He fills a large wooden vat with water and adds the shredded bark, stirring it thoroughly to ensure even distribution. Then the mixture sits for 3 to 5 days, during which the tannins leach from the bark into the water, creating a progressively darker and more concentrated solution. You can judge the strength by color and taste. Raoul explains, dipping a finger into a batch that's been steeping for 4 days. He touches the finger to his tongue, considers for a moment, and nods. Good strength. Ready to use. You're not quite ready to taste test chemical solutions, but you admire the confidence of someone whose palate has been calibrated by decades of experience. The chemistry of vegetable tanning is complex but fundamentally based on tannin molecules binding with collagen proteins in the hide. Tannins are polyphenolic compounds that have the ability to cross-link collagen fibers, creating a more stable, resistant structure that won't putrefy. Different plant sources provide different types of tannin. Spiragolol tannins from oak, catechol tannins from other species, and these produce slightly different leather characteristics. Oak tannins, which medieval European tanners favored, produce leather that's firm, durable, and takes dye well. Chestnut tannins work faster but produce slightly softer leather. Medieval tanners understood these differences empirically, describing leathers as having different tempers or characters, depending on the bark source, even though they couldn't explain the molecular mechanisms involved. Now comes the critical part, introducing a hide to the tanning process. You can't just throw a freshly prepared hide into full-strength tanning liquor. The result would be leather that's hard and brittle on the outside while remaining untanned in the middle. Instead, you need a graduated process, moving the hide through progressively stronger tanning solutions over a period of weeks or months. Guillaume walks you to the first pit in the tanning sequence. This is the suspender, he says. Weakest solution, just barely tannin colored. Hides spend 1 week here, getting their first exposure to tannins. This begins the tanning process gently, allows the tannins to start penetrating the hide structure without shocking the system. You help transfer a hide that's completed its baiting and rinsing into this first pit. The hide is pale, swollen from the lime and baiting treatments, and pliable like thick wet cloth. You lower it carefully into the suspender pit, and within minutes you can see the surface starting to take on a slight brownish tint as tannins begin binding with the outermost collagen fibers. The hide will stay submerged here for 7 days. Guillaume explains, we'll move it twice daily, morning and evening, to ensure even exposure to the liquor. If a hide sits in one position, the tannins concentrate on whatever surface is exposed, and you get uneven tanning, dark spots and light spots in the final leather. The moving process becomes part of your daily routine immediately. Using long hooks, you lift the hide to the surface, reposition it, and push it back under the liquor. The hide is heavy and awkward, fighting you with its water-soaked weight, and maneuvering it properly requires coordination between you and Pierre. You develop a rhythm: hook, lift, turn, reposition, submerge. The tanning liquor runs off the hide in streams, temporarily depleting the area around where you're working before diffusion redistributes the tannins. This constant agitation is crucial for quality control. Without it, you'd get leather that's usable but inconsistent, with variations in color and texture that mark it as inferior product. Here's where the time scale of medieval manufacturing becomes overwhelming. A hide entering the tanning sequence today will spend 1 week in the suspender, then move to a medium-strength pit for 2 weeks, then to a stronger pit for 3 weeks, then finally to a full-strength pit for anywhere from 2 to 6 months depending on the leather thickness and intended use. The entire process, from raw hide to finished leather, can take a year or more. This means Guillaume is simultaneously managing hides at dozens of different stages, tracking timing for each one, making decisions about when to advance each hide to the next pit. He maintains this information mentally, occasionally marking tallies on a wooden board, but mostly relying on memory and daily inspection routines. The economic implications are staggering when you think about them. Guillaume has capital tied up in hides that won't generate revenue for months or years. He's paying for bark, labor, and facility maintenance throughout this period without any income from the products in process. This is why medieval tanners needed significant startup capital, and why the profession tended to be hereditary. You inherited the business with its inventory of partially processed hides already in the pipeline. Starting a tannery from scratch required financing that few people could access, creating barriers to entry that protected established tanners from competition but also locked their children into the same profession. Around midday, you experience the first real satisfaction of the work. Guillaume shows you a hide that entered the tanning sequence 8 months ago and is now complete. He pulls it from the final pit, and the transformation is remarkable. What was once a pale, floppy, slightly disgusting membrane is now rich brown leather, firm but flexible, no longer smelling like dead animal but having its own distinct scent, that classic leather smell that's instantly recognizable. He hands you a corner to feel, and the texture is impressive. Smooth on the grain side, slightly rough on the flesh side, with a substance and weight that speaks to durability. This will become shoe leather, Guillaume says. Uppers for a cobbler in town who pays good prices for quality material. This moment holding finished leather for the first time after days of experiencing the disgusting processes required to create it gives you a new perspective on every leather object you've ever encountered. Every belt, every glove, every book cover, every saddle, every bag, all of them required this exact sequence of preparations. Someone handled that material when it was a reeking hide covered in maggots. Someone scraped off the flesh and fat with primitive tools. Someone soaked it in urine and feces and caustic chemicals. Someone monitored it for months as it slowly transformed in pits of tannin-rich liquor. The medieval economy ran on materials that demanded tremendous patience and tolerance for disgusting processes, and the people who provided these materials existed in a strange space, essential yet reviled, prosperous yet socially excluded. Historians still argue about productivity rates in medieval tanning. Some calculations suggest a single tannery like Guillaume's could process 300 to 500 hides annually, which seems like a lot until you consider that a prosperous town of 10,000 people might need several thousand hides per year just for shoes, clothing repairs, and household goods. This meant multiple tanneries in every town, all running the same slow processes, all requiring the same inputs of bark and chemicals and human labor. The cumulative environmental impact was significant. Streams downstream of tanneries were notoriously polluted. Forests were harvested for bark, and the air quality in tannery districts was genuinely hazardous. Medieval people accepted these costs as necessary for civilization, but they also spatially segregated the industry to minimize impacts on the general population. The afternoon is spent on maintenance tasks, checking tannin concentrations in various pits using the color and taste method, adding fresh bark liquor to pits that have been depleted by repeated use, removing spent bark from pits that need refreshing. You learn that tanning liquor gradually loses potency as the tannins bind with hide proteins, requiring periodic renewal. Guillaume maintains a rotation system. Pits get completely drained and refilled every 3 months, with spent liquor being used to water crops. The tannins have some value as weak fertilizer and pest deterrent. The spent bark gets composted and eventually sold to farmers as soil amendment. Even the waste products from the tanning process have economic value in a pre-industrial economy where nothing could be casually discarded. Pierre tells you stories about the tanning pits while you work. There's a local legend about a tanner who fell into a pit and wasn't discovered for 3 days. When they finally pulled him out, his skin had taken on a permanent brown stain from the tannins, and he lived the rest of his life with leather-colored skin. It's probably apocryphal, but it illustrates the folk anxiety about the tanning process. The sense that these chemicals were powerful enough to transform human bodies just as they transformed animal hides. The story serves as a cautionary tale about workplace safety. Medieval style. Be careful around the pits, or you might become part of the process yourself. As you move hides through their daily repositioning, you start to appreciate the skill involved in judging tanning progress. Guillaume can look at a hide and immediately assess how far along it is in the process, whether it needs more time, whether the current pit strength is appropriate. He demonstrates by showing you 3 hides at different stages. This one, he says, pointing to a hide with light tan coloring, just started in the medium pit last week. See how the color is still pale, and the leather is still somewhat soft when you pinch it? 3 more weeks here, then it moves to the strong pit. The second one, he indicates a darker hide, has been in the strong pit for 6 weeks. The color is good, but feel the center still some give, still not fully tanned through the thickness. Another month here, and this third hide is nearly done, even color. Firm throughout when you test it, no soft spots. Another week for finishing, then out it comes. You try to develop the same assessment skills, squeezing hides and trying to feel the difference between partially tanned and fully tanned leather. But your fingers aren't calibrated yet. It all feels vaguely similar, like firm rubber, somewhat pliable, damp, and you can't distinguish the subtle variations that Guillaume reads instantly. This is the accumulated expertise of decades, the tacit knowledge that separates a master craftsman from an apprentice. You could work here for years and still not match Guillaume's judgment, because he's internalized thousands of data points about how hides respond to tanning conditions, weather variations, seasonal changes in bark quality, and dozens of other variables that affect outcomes. The sun is descending toward the horizon when you finish the day's tanning pit maintenance. Your back aches from repeatedly bending over pits, and your hands are stained dark brown from the tannins. It will take days for this staining to fade, a temporary version of the legendary permanent staining from the local tales. But there's also a sense of accomplishment today that was missing from the earlier days of preparation work. You've participated in the actual transformation. moved hides through the process that converts dead animal tissue into durable material that will serve useful purposes for years. It doesn't make the earlier disgusting stages any less revolting, but it provides context, explains why anyone would tolerate such work. Guillaume gathers everyone for the evening address, a brief daily summary he apparently provides to keep the team coordinated. Tomorrow we drain and refresh the third strong pit. It's been running for 3 months and the liquor is depleted. That's heavy work. Lots of hauling. Jean and Andre will prepare fresh bark starting at dawn. Pierre and Thomas will handle the standard rotation movements. Our new friend here, he nods at you, will help Raoul with the draining. We also have a commission delivery next week, 20 cowhides for the Saddlers Guild. Those are in various stages now, but several will need accelerated processing. Plan for long days. This is project management in a pre-literate environment. Coordination achieved through oral communication and shared understanding of the work's rhythms. As you leave the tannery that evening, you pass the rows of tanning pits, each one a small ecosystem of chemical transformation, each hide a work in progress that will take months to complete. The medieval world moved slowly in ways that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. You couldn't just order leather online and have it delivered tomorrow. Someone had to process it through every stage, waiting for chemistry and time to do their work, managing complex operations without computers or written schedules or any of the tools that make modern manufacturing efficient. The patience required was astronomical, and the social structures that supported this patience guilds, apprenticeships, hereditary professions make more sense when you understand the timescales involved. You needed generational commitment to work that paid off slowly, and you needed family structures to maintain institutional knowledge across decades. The tannery isn't just a workplace, it's a multi-generational project that will outlive everyone currently working here, and they all know it. By the 5th morning, you're moving through the tannery gates with something approaching routine, though your body still protests every motion and the smell remains aggressively unpleasant. Today brings a different kind of education. Master Guillaume has invited you to accompany him into town to deliver finished leather to a merchant client, and you're about to experience firsthand the social reality of being a tanner in medieval society. Guillaume changes into what passes for his town clothes, a slightly less stained tunic, a cleaner cloak, but there's no escaping the smell that's embedded in his hair, his skin, the very pores of his body. They'll know what I am before I speak a word, he says matter-of-factly, adjusting his belt. Best to accept it and move forward. The walk into town takes 20 minutes, following a worn path that skirts the main road. You notice Guillaume doesn't take the direct route, stays downwind, keeps to less traveled approaches, essentially minimizing his interaction with normal townsfolk. Even from a distance, you can see people's reactions when they catch the tannery smell on the breeze. Noses wrinkle, heads turn away, mothers pull children closer as if proximity to a tanner might somehow contaminate them. Nobody says anything directly. Guillaume has lived here his whole life. His family has supplied leather to this town for 3 generations, but the body language is unmistakable. You are other. You are unclean. You are necessary but unwelcome. The leather merchant's shop sits on a prosperous street near the main market square, a half-timbered building with glazed windows and a painted sign showing a boot and glove. Guillaume carries a bundle of finished leather over his shoulder, 6 cowhides, beautifully tanned to a rich brown, supple and even-colored, representing months of labor and considerable material value. He enters through a side door, not the main entrance, and you follow into a back room where finished leathers are stored and business is conducted. The merchant, a well-fed man named Bertrand with soft hands and expensive clothes, greets Guillaume with professional courtesy that somehow manages to convey distance. They don't shake hands. Bertrand doesn't invite Guillaume to sit. This is a business transaction between people of vastly different social standing, and the power dynamic is crystal clear. Bertrand inspects the leather with practiced efficiency, checking color consistency, testing flexibility, examining both sides for flaws or thin spots. His assessment is thorough, but Keek knows quality when he sees it, and Guillaume's work is apparently satisfactory. Excellent as always, Bertrand says, though his tone suggests this is the minimum acceptable standard rather than genuine praise. I'll take all 6 at the agreed price, 2 sous per hide. Guillaume nods without negotiating, and you realize the price was settled weeks or months ago when the hides first entered production. Bertrand counts out 12 sous in silver coins, placing them on the table rather than handing them directly to Guillaume. The tanner collects the money and tucks it into a leather purse, obviously his own work, without comment. The transaction takes perhaps 5 minutes, and then you're dismissed. Bertrand doesn't ask about Guillaume's family, doesn't inquire about business conditions, doesn't engage in the social pleasantries that typically accompany medieval commerce. Guillaume is a supplier, useful but distasteful, and the merchant minimizes their interaction to the bare necessities. As you exit through the side door, you notice a wealthy customer entering through the front, a woman in fine wool clothing, probably minor nobility or a prosperous merchant's wife, and the contrast is jarring. She'll be welcomed into the showroom, offered wine, treated with elaborate courtesy as she selects leather goods, completely insulated from any awareness of where those goods originated or who produced them. That's the best of my business relationships, Guillaume says quietly as you walk back toward the Tannery district. Bertrand pays promptly and fairly, doesn't try to renegotiate prices after work is complete, doesn't reject leather on spurious grounds. Some merchants are far worse. They'll claim defects that don't exist, demand price reductions, delay payment for months, but all of them treat us the same way, as necessary unpleasantness to be managed efficiently and avoided socially. There's no bitterness in his voice, just pragmatic acceptance of reality. This is the life he was born into, the life his children will inherit, and emotional energy spent resenting it is wasted energy. You walk through the main market briefly, and the experience is educational in the worst way. People literally move away as you pass, creating a bubble of empty space around Guillaume even in the crowded market lanes. Vendors don't offer their wares as you walk by. They know a tanner has no money for luxury goods, or perhaps they simply don't want the transaction. Children point and whisper until their parents shush them. A priest crossing the square makes a subtle gesture that might be a blessing or might be a warning sign against contamination. Guillaume navigates through this social minefield with practiced indifference, keeping his eyes forward, not engaging, just moving through the space as efficiently as possible before returning to the margins where he belongs. Here's something that doesn't appear in most sanitized histories of medieval life. Tanners were sometimes legally prohibited from certain activities available to other citizens. In some European cities, tanners couldn't serve on town councils or juries. They were excluded from certain guilds and religious confraternities. In extreme cases, they were required to live in designated districts and faced curfews or movement restrictions. The legal basis for this discrimination was murky, partly rooted in concerns about contamination and disease, partly in religious ideas about ritual purity, partly in simple class prejudice. But the practical effect was clear. Tanning marked you as a permanent underclass, and that status was often encoded in law as well as custom. Back at the tannery, the afternoon brings more sobering realities about the social consequences of the profession. Pierre tells you about his romantic situation. There's a girl he likes, daughter of a blacksmith, but her father has forbidden any contact. He says his daughter won't marry into a tanning family. Pierre explains with forced casualness that doesn't quite hide his hurt. Says we're cursed, that our children will be cursed. It doesn't matter that my father has steady work and owns property. Doesn't matter that I'll be a journeyman in a few years with decent prospects. We're tanners, and that's all anyone sees. He's 14 years old, and he's already internalized the knowledge that his romantic options will be limited to other tanning families, that he'll likely marry a tanner's daughter in an arrangement negotiated between families who understand their shared social isolation. The matrimonial politics of tanning families were actually quite complex, because tanners could generally only marry within their profession. The community developed tight-knit networks across towns and regions. Master tanners from different cities knew each other, corresponded about their children's ages and temperaments, negotiated marriage alliances that would connect family businesses and share technical knowledge. It was simultaneously a coping mechanism for social exclusion and a way to preserve guild secrets if tanners only married other tanners. Proprietary techniques stayed within the professional community. Guillaume himself married the daughter of a tanner from a neighboring town, and their match was arranged when both were children, the families seeing mutual benefit in the alliance. Historians still argue about whether medieval tanners were legally classified as infamous persons whose testimony couldn't be trusted in court. The evidence is mixed. Some regional law codes explicitly listed tanners alongside executioners and prostitutes as infamous, while others made no such distinction. But the practical social reality was often harsher than the legal classification. Even in jurisdictions where tanners technically had full legal rights, judges and juries treated their testimony skeptically, and townspeople assumed moral as well as physical uncleanliness. The association between working with dead animals, waste products, and moral degradation was deeply embedded in medieval thinking, and no amount of legal equality could override cultural prejudice. The religious dimension of tanner stigma was particularly complex. Medieval Christianity had inherited Jewish purity laws that classified certain occupations as ritually unclean, and while Christianity theoretically rejected these distinctions, practical attitudes often preserved them. Tanners could attend church, receive sacraments, and participate in religious life, but they often sat in designated areas, received communion last, and faced subtle social segregation even in supposedly egalitarian worship spaces. Some monasteries and religious orders refused to accept leather goods from Jewish tanners specifically, claiming they were doubly unclean both by profession and by religion, though they'd accept leather from Christian tanners. The theological reasoning was tortured and inconsistent, but it created real economic and social consequences. Guillaume shares some of this history during the afternoon break, sitting in the workshop's shade and drinking weak beer while apprentices doze in the autumn sun. My grandfather told me about a tanner 2 towns over who made money, bought land, tried to join the merchant guild. He says, they rejected him. He appealed to the count, argued he had the wealth and standing. The count ruled in the guild's favor, said that wealth couldn't wash away the taint of the profession. The man ended up selling his land and moving away, starting over somewhere no one knew his background. That's the only way out. You have to flee your entire history. Pretend you were never a tanner. Hope no one discovers the truth. This possibility of escape through geographical mobility was rare but not impossible. Medieval society was less mobile than modern society, but people did move between towns, and if you could arrive somewhere with enough money and a plausible cover story, you might successfully reinvent yourself. Some tanner families managed this transition over generations. The grandfather remained a tanner, but he saved money and bought property. The father kept tanning but educated his sons in literacy and arithmetic. The sons moved to a distant city, claimed to be merchants or craftsmen from another town, and broke into respectable guilds. It required planning, resources, and luck, but it happened often enough that it represented a distant hope for families trapped in stigmatized professions. The economic success of tanners made their social exclusion more painful in some ways. Guillaume is probably wealthier than half the shopkeepers in town, owns his property, employs 8 workers, has steady income from essential products. But wealth doesn't translate to social acceptance when your profession marks you as permanently other. There are beggars who occupy higher social positions than Guillaume in terms of where they can go, who will speak with them, whose children might marry their children. This is the peculiar cruelty of medieval status hierarchies. Economic class and social class were related but not identical, and you could be prosperous while remaining fundamentally excluded from respectable society. As evening approaches, Raoul shares his own story of social rejection. He'd been hired to repair a wealthy merchant's book. The leather binding was cracking and needed replacement. He did beautiful work, carefully matching the original color and texture, charging a fair price. When he delivered the finished book, the merchant accepted it but then refused to allow Raoul into his home again, conducting all future business through a servant intermediary. He was happy to use my skills, Raoul says without apparent emotion, but he wouldn't contaminate his house by allowing me inside twice. The book was acceptable. I was not. That's the distinction we live with. The psychological toll of this constant social rejection is difficult to quantify but clearly significant. The tanners develop protective mechanisms, tight family bonds, professional pride, dark humor about their situation, aggressive pragmatism. They focus on the work's necessities and try not to dwell on the social costs. But you can see it in quieter moments. Pierre's carefully casual attitude about his romantic rejection, Guillaume's matter-of-fact acceptance of side-door entrances, Raoul's studied indifference to being treated as contaminated. These are people who've learned to function in a society that simultaneously depends on them and reviles them, and the mental gymnastics required to maintain self-worth in that environment are exhausting. Here's a quirky historical detail that somehow makes the situation more poignant. Tanners were often excellent musicians. Many tanning families maintained musical traditions, playing instruments during evening hours, singing work songs during the tedious parts of the job. Some scholars speculate this was a coping mechanism. Music provided social cohesion within the excluded tanning community and offered emotional release from difficult circumstances. Others suggest tanners had more leisure time than agricultural workers because tanning involved long waiting periods between active interventions. Either way, there's documentation of tanning districts producing accomplished musicians who performed for their own communities but were rarely invited to perform for respectable society. That evening, after the work is done and the apprentices have gathered for supper, someone produces a simple flute and begins playing a melancholy melody. Others join in with wordless harmonies, and for a few minutes the tannery compound is filled with surprisingly beautiful music. Pierre's voice is clear and strong. Raoul hums a bass line, and even Guillaume adds occasional notes when the melody allows. It's a moment of unexpected grace in a place defined by filth and labor, a reminder that the people doing this disgusting work are fully human with artistic sensibilities and emotional needs. The music ends, the moment passes, and everyone returns to their bread and beer and the comfortable silence of exhausted workers. But you'll remember it, Prof, that social exclusion and occupational stigma couldn't crush the human capacity for beauty and connection. You leave the tannery that night with a different understanding of medieval labor. It's not just about the physical difficulty or the disgusting processes, it's about the comprehensive social cost of certain professions, the way entire families could be trapped in excluded categories for generations, marked as essential but undesirable. The leather goods that furnished medieval life, the shoes and belts and book covers and saddles, were produced by people who paid an enormous social price for their utility. Every time a respectable medieval citizen purchased leather goods, they were benefiting from labor they would never acknowledge, from skills they would never respect, from people they would never willingly associate with. The tanning industry reveals the ugly truth beneath medieval commerce. Civilization was built on hierarchies of contamination, and someone had to occupy the bottom tiers regardless of personal merit or economic success. The sixth day begins with an uncomfortable conversation about money. Master Guillaume sits you down before the work starts and explains the economics of tanning with brutal honesty. People see finished leather selling for good prices and assume we're wealthy, he says, spreading a handful of coins on the workshop table. Let me show you why that's wrong. What follows is a detailed breakdown of tannery economics that reveals just how precarious this seemingly essential business actually is. For those 6 cowhides he sold yesterday, representing 8 to 10 months of processing time, he received 12 sous. Sounds reasonable until he walks you through the expenses. The raw hides cost him 7 sous total, purchased from butchers. The oak bark for their tanning required 2 sous worth of material. Labor costs feeding and housing the apprentices. Paying the journeymen their wages consumed another 2 sous allocated to these specific hides. Maintenance on the pits, replacement tools, fuel for heating water, miscellaneous supplies added up to roughly half a sou. That leaves Guillaume with a profit of half a sou per hide, or 3 sous total from the batch. For nearly a year of capital tied up in slowly processing materials, his profit margin is maybe 25%, and that's before accounting for his own living expenses, taxes to the town, and mandatory guild contributions. And that's when everything goes right. Guillaume continues. If hides are damaged during processing, torn in the beam house, overlimed, improperly tanned, I absorb the loss completely. Merchants won't accept defective leather, and I can't sell it elsewhere for anything close to full price. Last year, I lost 4 hides to a lime pit accident when an apprentice mixed the solution too strong. For hides, at nearly a year's processing time each, complete loss. That single mistake wiped out my profit for 3 months. This is the reality of medieval manufacturing. Thin margins, long production cycles, catastrophic losses from minor errors, and absolutely no insurance or safety net to cushion failures. The guild structure that supposedly protected tanners actually extracted significant value from them. Guillaume pays annual dues to the Tanners Guild, not optional. Membership is mandatory for legal operation, which entitles him to certain monopoly protections but also obligates him to follow guild rules about pricing, production methods, and apprentice treatment. The guild sets minimum prices to prevent ruinous competition, but these minimums are often below what tanners need for comfortable margins because the guild leadership has to balance tanner interests against pressure from leather merchants and town authorities. The guild protects us from being completely exploited, Guillaume says, but it also keeps us poor enough that we can't challenge the system. Here's where the economics get truly trap-like. Starting a tannery requires enormous capital. You need land, ideally near water but outside town walls. You need to construct multiple pits deep, stone-lined, waterproofed at significant expense. You need vats, beams, tools, and a covered workspace. You need to purchase initial inventory of hides, bark, and lime. Most importantly, you need operating capital to survive the year-plus lag between purchasing raw hides and selling finished leather. Historians estimate that establishing a modest tannery in the 13th century required investment equivalent to perhaps 5 years' wages for a skilled craftsman, a sum that only wealthy families or those with existing tanning businesses could possibly access. This capital requirement is why tanning remained hereditary. Guillaume inherited this tannery from his father, who inherited it from his father. The infrastructure, the partially processed inventory, the business relationships, the guild membership all passed down as a package. Starting fresh was nearly impossible unless you were a journeyman who married into a tanning family and eventually took over the operation. The high barriers to entry protected established tanners from competition, but they also meant that if you were born into a tanning family, you were effectively trapped. You had access to capital and training that would let you continue tanning, but you had no way to accumulate enough wealth to exit the profession and establish yourself in a more respectable trade. The pricing structure reveals another economic trap. Leather merchants, the middlemen between tanners and final consumers, captured most of the value in the supply chain. Bertrand buys Guillaume's leather for 2 sous per hide and probably sells it to craftsmen, cobblers, saddlers, bookbinders, for 3 or 4 sous per hide. The craftsmen then create finished products that sell for many times the raw leather cost. A pair of shoes might sell for 6 or 8 sous, even though the leather in them cost the cobbler maybe 1 sou. The tanner, who did the most disgusting and time-consuming work, captured the smallest share of the final value. But the tanner had no way to bypass the merchant. The social stigma prevented direct access to respectable craftsmen and consumers. Guillaume explains this dynamic matter-of-factly. Bertrand has clean hands and a shop on a respectable street. He can enter the cobbler's guild hall, negotiate contracts, maintain relationships with master craftsmen who won't speak to me directly. He provides access to markets I'm excluded from by my smell and my reputation. So he takes his share, and I accept it, because without him I'd have no buyers at all. This is economic exploitation enabled by social hierarchy. The merchant extracts value not through superior skill or capital investment, but simply through social acceptability. It's rent-seeking based on status, and it's perfectly legal and broadly accepted as normal business practice. The taxation system added another burden. Tanners paid regular taxes to town authorities like any business, but they also faced special levies that other trades didn't encounter. Some towns charged tanners extra fees for environmental contamination of streams, even though the town authorized tanneries to operate in those locations. Some required tanners to pay for street cleaning in their districts at higher rates than other neighborhoods. The rationale was that tanneries created extra municipal expenses, but the practical effect was additional tax burden on an already marginal profession. Guillaume pays roughly 15% of his gross revenue in various taxes and fees, compared to perhaps 10% for more respectable trades. The apprenticeship system, while providing labor, also created economic obligations that limited profit potential. Guillaume is legally and morally required to house, feed, and train his apprentices for 7 years, during which they contribute progressively more valuable labor but never receive wages. In theory, this is fair exchange training for labor, but in practice, apprentices become productive workers long before their terms end, and masters are obligated to continue supporting them regardless. Pierre will finish his term in 5 years, Guillaume says, and by then he'll be as skilled as Raoul, doing journeyman quality work but still costing me bed and board. That's 2 years of productive labor I'm providing for free, essentially, because guild regulations require completing the full 7-year term. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds primarily protected workers or primarily benefited masters. The evidence suggests a complex reality. Guilds did limit competition, maintain quality standards, and provide some collective bargaining power against merchant exploitation. But they also concentrated power in the hands of established masters, created barriers to entry that protected incumbents, and often served masters' interests at the expense of journeymen and apprentices. In the tanning guild specifically, regulations were written primarily by successful tanners like Guillaume, and unsurprisingly, those regulations tended to protect established businesses while making it difficult for journeymen to become independent masters. The afternoon brings a practical demonstration of economic precariousness. A hide that's been in the final tanning pit for 6 months is pulled for inspection, and Guillaume discovers a problem. There's a weak spot near one edge where the leather is significantly thinner than the rest of the hide. Probably a scar or brand mark on the living animal. He explains, flexing the area and grimacing. The damaged tissue didn't take the tanning properly. The hide is still usable, but it's now second quality, worth maybe 60% of full price. You watch him calculate mentally. This hide cost him just over a sou in materials and labor. He was expecting to sell it for 2 sous, but now he'll be lucky to get 1 sou and 2 deniers. A year's processing time has resulted in minimal profit, possibly a loss depending on how accurately he estimated his input costs. This happens regularly, Guillaume says. Maybe 1 hide in 10 has some defect that reduces final value. You can't predict it from looking at raw hides. The problems only become apparent after months of processing. So you build these losses into your pricing expectations, which means you're always operating on thinner margins than the nominal prices suggest. This is risk management in a medieval context. You can't insure against these losses. You can't diversify your product line significantly. You just have to accept that a certain percentage of your work will fail to generate expected returns and hope that the successes outweigh the failures over time. The economic comparison to other medieval professions is instructive. A skilled mason or carpenter might earn 3 to 4 sous per week in wages, with fairly steady employment during building seasons. A successful merchant dealing in cloth or spices might see 50% or higher profit margins on goods that turned over in weeks or months rather than years. Even agricultural work, while harder and more precarious than urban crafts, offered the possibility of bumper harvest years when a peasant family might actually accumulate savings. Tanning offered steady work but minimal accumulation potential. You could survive, even live reasonably well, but you couldn't get ahead, couldn't build significant wealth, couldn't leverage success into dramatically better circumstances. Guillaume's strategy for economic survival involves diversification within the tanning trade. He processes mostly cowhides because they're the bread and butter of the business, But he also takes on specialty commissions, the vellum work for monasteries, occasional sheepskin processing, rare orders for goatskin leather that commands premium prices. These specialty items represent maybe 15% of his volume but 30% of his profit because the margins are better and the social stigma is slightly less intense when dealing with religious institutions or luxury goods makers. The monastery steward doesn't enjoy meeting with me, Guillaume notes, but he needs quality vellum and he's willing to pay for it, so he tolerates the interaction. The generational wealth trajectory of tanning families reveals the economic trap most clearly. Guillaume is approximately as wealthy as his father was at the same age, who was approximately as wealthy as his father before him. 3 generations of competent work, business management, and guild participation have produced economic stasis. There's no upward mobility, no accumulation of capital that would let the next generation exit tanning for a better trade. Pierre's children will almost certainly be tanners, as will their children, stretching forward indefinitely unless some external shock plague or economic collapse destroys the family business entirely and forces them into even worse circumstances. Here's a quirky economic detail that illustrates medieval market complexity. Leather prices varied seasonally in ways that tanners couldn't fully exploit. Demand peaked in autumn when people purchased new shoes and winter clothing, but leather couldn't be produced faster to meet this demand because the tanning process took a year. So tanners had to predict demand a year in advance, processing hides during autumn of one year to sell in autumn of the following year. Guess wrong about next year's demand and you might have excess inventory you can't sell, or insufficient inventory to meet orders. Guillaume maintains careful mental records of past year's sales patterns and adjusts his production accordingly, but it's essentially gambling on future market conditions with a year's lag time. The debt trap was another economic danger. Some tanners borrowed money to expand operations or survive slow periods, using their equipment or property as collateral. Interest rates on such loans were often ruinous. 10 to 20% annually was common, sometimes higher, and many tanners found themselves in permanent debt servitude, working primarily to pay interest rather than generating profit. Guillaume has avoided debt by maintaining conservative operations and building reserves during good years, but he's seen other tanners lose everything to creditors. Once you're in debt to a merchant or moneylender, he says quietly, you're finished. They own you. Better to stay small and independent than expand with borrowed money and become someone's servant. As evening settles over the compound, you help Guillaume update his mental accounting, walking through the various hides currently in process and calculating their eventual value against their input costs. It's a sobering exercise that reveals just how little profit margin exists in this essential medieval industry. The workers are fed, the facility is maintained, the business continues, but there's no wealth accumulation, no surplus that might be invested in other ventures or saved for emergencies. It's economic survival, nothing more. Nothing less achieved through unpleasant labor that society simultaneously requires and despises. The apprentices gather for their evening meal, unaware that the economic structure they're embedded in almost guarantees they'll spend their lives doing exactly this work at exactly this income level. Their 7-year apprenticeships aren't primarily about learning skills theory about socialization into acceptance of their economic fate. By the time they complete their terms, they'll have internalized the reality that this is their ceiling, this is as good as it gets, and ambitions beyond competent tanning and modest prosperity are foolish dreams. It's a system that works reasonably well at producing leather and maintaining social stability, But it's also a system that traps people in predetermined economic roles regardless of individual talent or effort. You leave that evening understanding that the economic trap of tanning was as confining as the social stigma, maybe more so. You could theoretically imagine overcoming social prejudice through exceptional circumstances, but you couldn't escape the mathematics of thin profit margins, high capital requirements, and structural barriers to advancement. The medieval economy wasn't a meritocracy, it was a carefully maintained hierarchy where birth determined destination, and the labor required to maintain civilization was provided by people who would never be adequately compensated for their contributions. The leather that furnished medieval life was produced by workers who could never afford most of the finished goods made from their own products. And this contradiction was so normalized that nobody even remarked upon it. By the seventh morning, you've accumulated enough experience to understand the complete cycle of leather production, from rotting hide to finished product. And today Master Guillaume wants to show you something different, the broader context of how tanning shaped not just individual lives but entire civilizations. He leads you to the finishing workshop, a cleaner area where the real transformation happens, where leather that's completed its months-long tanning journey receives its final treatments and becomes the material that built empires. Everything you've seen this week, the disgusting preparation, the caustic chemicals, the endless waiting, all of it serves this moment. He says, holding up a piece of finished leather that gleams with a deep, rich brown color. This is what made Rome possible, what allowed medieval knights to fight, what let scholars preserve knowledge across centuries. The finishing process begins with dried leather that's emerged from the final tanning pit. These hides are stiff, somewhat brittle, and unevenly colored, functional but far from beautiful. Raoul demonstrates the first finishing step, applying oil to the leather surface using a cloth wrapped around a smooth stone. He works the oil into the grain side with circular motions, gradually softening the leather and bringing out its natural luster. The oil, typically neatsfoot oil rendered from cattle hooves and shin bones, penetrates the leather structure, lubricating the collagen fibers and giving the material flexibility. Without oiling, leather stays stiff and cracks with use. Raoul explains, the oil makes it durable, gives it that characteristic feel that people associate with quality leather goods. You try your hand at the oiling process, and it's surprisingly pleasant work after a week of handling disgusting materials. The leather gradually transforms under your hands, becoming suppler and developing a soft sheen. The smell is even acceptable. The neatsfoot oil has a mild, slightly sweet odor that almost masks the underlying tannery stench. This is skilled work requiring judgment about how much oil to apply and how long to work it. Too little and the leather remains stiff. Too much and it becomes greasy and won't accept certain finishes or dyes. Pierre works beside you on another hide, his movements confident and efficient, demonstrating the muscle memory developed over years of repetition. The historical importance of leather is difficult to overstate. Ancient Roman legions conquered much of the known world partly because their soldiers wore leather armor, boots, and belts that provided protection, durability, and mobility impossible with other available materials. A Roman legionary's kit included leather sandals that could march 20 miles per day, leather straps holding armor segments together, leather scabbards protecting weapons, and leather bags carrying supplies. The Roman military-industrial complex required enormous quantities of leather, which meant extensive tanning operations wherever legions were stationed. Archaeological excavations at Roman military sites consistently find evidence of large-scale tanneries, suggesting the empire understood that military success depended partly on reliable leather supply chains. Medieval warfare continued this dependence on leather with even greater intensity. A knight's armor wasn't just metal plates, it was metal plates backed with leather, held together with leather straps, worn over leather padding that absorbed impact and prevented chafing. The knight's horse wore leather tack and sometimes leather armor of its own. Crossbows and longbows required leather components. Siege engines used leather hinges and padding. Military camps were full of leather tents, water bags, and equipment cases. Historians estimate that outfitting a single knight for battle required leather from perhaps 5 to 8 animals, several cowhides for armor backing and straps, sheepskin for padding, goatskin for gloves, and various hides for horse equipment. Multiply that by thousands of knights, and medieval warfare created insatiable demand for tanned leather. Guillaume shows you examples of specialized military leather his workshop has produced over the years. There's a piece of queer bull leather that's been boiled or soaked in hot water and then shaped while pliable, hardening into rigid armor as it dries. The secret is getting the water temperature exactly right, he explains. Too cool and the leather doesn't soften enough to shape. Too hot and the collagen structure breaks down and you get weak leather. The sweet spot is just below boiling hot enough to make the leather plastic, but not so hot it damages the fibers. This is practical materials engineering accomplished through careful observation, the same empirical method that characterizes all medieval crafts. The cuir bouilli technique produced leather armor that was genuinely effective against many medieval weapons. A properly hardened leather breastplate could turn aside glancing sword blows, deflect arrows from moderate distances, and provide protection approaching that of metal armor at a fraction of the weight. Leather armor was cheaper than metal, easier to repair, and more comfortable for extended wear. Historians still argue about exactly how effective leather armor was. Some suggest it was primarily used by lower status soldiers who couldn't afford metal, while others argue that even wealthy warriors often chose leather for its practical advantages. The evidence suggests both perspectives have merit. Leather armor was ubiquitous across all social classes, used alone by those who couldn't afford better and in combination with metal by those who could. But warfare was just one application. The medieval book industry depended absolutely on leather for bindings and, in earlier centuries, for vellum pages themselves. Every manuscript, every preserved text, every transmitted piece of knowledge required leather production. The great medieval libraries, monasteries preserving classical learning, university collections enabling scholarly advancement were literally buildings full of dead animal skins that had been processed through the disgusting methods you've experienced this week. When you read about medieval intellectual achievement, about the preservation of classical texts or the development of scholastic philosophy, you're reading about accomplishments that required thousands of tanners doing revolting work so that monks and scholars could have writing surfaces and protective covers for their precious documents. Guillaume walks you through other historical applications. Leather was essential for water management buckets, pipes, seals for pumps and irrigation systems. It was crucial for transportation horse tack, wagon traces. Ship rigging used leather components extensively. It was fundamental to domestic life: shoes, belts, bags, bottle covers, door hinges, window seals. Look around any medieval town, Guillaume says, and every third object you see either is leather or required leather tools to manufacture. Civilization at this technological level isn't possible without extensive leather production, which means it's not possible without people willing to do what we do here. Here's a quirky historical detail that reveals just how pervasive leather was. Medieval medical practice used leather for numerous applications. Surgeons used leather straps to restrain patients during operations, anesthesia being limited to alcohol and herbal preparations that rarely worked well. Doctors prescribed leather pouches filled with herbs to be worn against the skin for various ailments. Plague doctors wore leather gloves and sometimes full leather coats, believing the material provided protection against disease. Not entirely wrong, as leather did create a barrier against flea bites that transmitted plague bacteria. Battlefield surgeons used tanned leather for wound dressings and bandages. The medical leather market was small but steady, and tanners like Guillaume maintained relationships with local physicians and barber surgeons who paid well for quality material. The economic impact of the leather trade rippled through medieval society in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Tanners required oak bark, which meant foresters and woodcutters had a market for material they'd otherwise discard. Butchers could sell hides for additional income beyond meat sales, making animal husbandry more profitable. Cobblers, saddlers, bookbinders, and dozens of other craftsmen built entire professions around working with finished leather. The leather trade supported subsidiary industries, lime production, cooperage for vats and barrels, tool manufacturing, creating employment webs that touched thousands of workers. Shutting down leather production would collapse multiple sectors of the medieval economy simultaneously. The tanning guild's role in maintaining this economic ecosystem was more sophisticated than you'd initially assumed. Guillaume explains that guild regulations served multiple purposes beyond just protecting established tanners. By maintaining quality standards, requiring specific tanning methods, mandating minimum processing times, inspecting finished leather, the guild ensured that European leather had reliable characteristics that buyers could depend on. This quality consistency enabled long-distance trade. A merchant in Italy could order leather from England with reasonable confidence that it would meet minimum standards. The guild regulations that seemed oppressive to individual tanners actually created market trust that benefited everyone in the trade. But the guild also controlled knowledge transfer in ways that shaped technological development. Tanning techniques were guild secrets, taught only to properly indentured apprentices, protected from outsiders. This meant that innovations, better lime formulations, more efficient pit designs, improved finishing techniques spread slowly through the network of guild tanners but didn't reach beyond those boundaries. Some historians argue this secrecy slowed technological progress, keeping tanning methods relatively static for centuries. Others counter that the guild system actually encouraged innovation by protecting inventors from immediate copying, allowing masters like Guillaume to profit from their improvements before competitors adopted them. The comparison to other leather-producing cultures reveals interesting patterns. Islamic tanners developed different techniques, using different tanning agents, particularly sumac and alum rather than oak bark, producing leather with different characteristics, softer, more colorful, often considered superior for luxury goods. The term Morocco leather comes from North African tanning centers that produced goatskin leather of extraordinary quality using techniques European tanners couldn't replicate. Chinese tanners developed their own methods, and their leather goods entered European markets through the Silk Road, representing exotic alternatives to domestic production. The fact that different civilizations independently developed tanning techniques suggests this technology was virtually inevitable. Any society that domesticated animals and wanted to preserve their skins eventually figured out versions of the processes you've experienced this week. The afternoon brings your final major task, helping prepare a shipment of finished leather for a bulk order. A saddler's guild in a neighboring town has commissioned 20 cowhides, and they need to be inspected sorted by quality, rolled for transport, and packaged in protective cloth wrapping. You work with Thomas, the senior apprentice who's almost ready to complete his term, and he shows you how to assess finished leather quality. Look for even coloring light or dark patches that suggest uneven tanning. He explains, check the thickness by feel it should be consistent across the hide. Flex it to test for weak spots or cracks. Smell it properly tanned leather has a clean, earthy smell, not sour or rotting. This quality inspection reveals just how much can go wrong even after months of careful processing. Of the 20 hides prepared for this order, 2 are rejected as second quality due to color inconsistencies, and 1 is borderline. Guillaume makes the judgment call to include it, gambling that the buyer won't reject it. If they send it back, I eat the cost, he says pragmatically, but I think it's acceptable, and we've built enough relationship with this guild that they'll probably accept borderline quality rather than dealing with return logistics. This is business decision-making at the margins, where personal relationships and reputation matter as much as objective quality metrics. The rolling and packing process is oddly satisfying, taking these products of months of disgusting labor and preparing them for transport to craftsmen who'll transform them into useful objects. Each hide gets rolled flesh side out to protect the grain surface, then wrapped in undyed wool cloth for protection during transport. The bundles are labeled with marks that indicate leather type, quality grade, and quantity, a form of medieval inventory management using symbols that any guild member would recognize. The whole package will be loaded onto a cart tomorrow and carried to the neighboring town, completing the cycle that began nearly a year ago when these animals were slaughtered and their hides arrived at the tannery gates. Guillaume gathers everyone for a final evening reflection, and his words carry unusual weight. You've spent a week with us, he says, addressing you directly, and you've seen what this work really requires. The disgusting preparations, the caustic chemicals, the endless waiting, the social stigma, the economic precariousness. Now you know what goes into every leather object you'll ever encounter. Every shoe, every book cover, every belt. Someone did this work. Someone handled rotting flesh, soaked hides in urine and feces, burned their hands with lime, spent months monitoring pits of tanning liquor. This work built Rome, enabled the medieval church to preserve knowledge, made warfare possible at scale, and furnished daily life with essential materials. He pauses, looking around at his apprentices and journeymen, this small community of workers doing society's essential but reviled labor. We're not respected for this work. We're pushed to the margins, treated as untouchable. Our children inherit our stigma along with our skills. But we're necessary. Without us, civilization at this technological level collapses. The social order that rejects us depends absolutely on our continued labor. That's the contradiction. We live with essential but excluded, prosperous but permanently stigmatized. We've built our own community here because respectable society won't accept us. And we take pride in our craft because quality work is its own reward, even when society doesn't acknowledge it. Historians still argue about whether medieval tanners resented their social position or accepted it as natural hierarchy. The evidence suggests complex reality. Tanners certainly understood they were being exploited and socially marginalized, but they also developed coping mechanisms and found meaning in their work. Guild records show tanners occasionally petitioning for better treatment or protesting particularly egregious discrimination, but they also show tanners taking pride in their craft, maintaining rigorous quality standards, and building tight-knit communities. The psychological accommodation to stigmatized work probably varied by individual, but the system perpetuated itself across centuries, suggesting most tanners found ways to live with their circumstances even if they didn't love them. As darkness falls on your seventh day, you help secure the compound for the night-covering pits, storing tools, checking that all fires are properly extinguished. The tannery will continue its work tomorrow and the day after, processing new hides through the same stages you've experienced, following methods refined across generations, producing materials that society needs even while rejecting the people who provide them. Pierre will continue his apprenticeship, learning skills that will trap him in this profession while providing livelihood. Thomas will finish his term soon and likely become a journeyman in a nearby tannery, perhaps eventually marrying into a tanning family and inheriting a workshop. The cycle continues, generation after generation, because civilization requires leather and someone has to produce it. The walk away from the tannery takes you back toward the sounds and smells of normal town life-bread baking, metalworking, the evening calls of street vendors. The contrast is jarring after a week immersed in the tannery's reality. You can't help but notice leather everywhere now. The shoes people wear, the bags they carry, the gloves on that merchant's hands, the book that priest is holding. Each object represents months of work by people like Guillaume and his crew, people whose labor is invisible to the consumers who benefit from it. The medieval economy, like most economies before and since, depended on this invisibility, making essential workers vanish from awareness so consumers could enjoy products without confronting the human cost of their production. You've survived a week in a medieval leather tannery. Though survived is perhaps too generous a word for merely enduring what these workers face daily for their entire lives. You've handled decomposing flesh, soaked hides in urine and feces, burned your hands with caustic chemicals, monitored pits of tanning liquor, and experienced the social stigma that follows tanners everywhere. You've learned that leather production essential to civilization, ubiquitous in medieval life, required labor so disgusting that workers were permanently marked as untouchable by respectable society. And you've understood that this contradiction between necessity and revulsion, between economic value and social stigma, defined not just tanning but many medieval professions that did the difficult, dangerous, or degrading work that kept civilization functioning. The leather that built empires, preserved knowledge, equipped armies, and furnished daily life was produced by people whose society simultaneously required and rejected, whose skills were essential but whose presence was unwelcome, who could achieve modest prosperity but never social acceptance. This is the uncomfortable truth beneath medieval material culture. The objects that historians study and museums display were often produced by workers whose lives were defined by exclusion and hardship, whose labor was undercompensated and whose contributions were unacknowledged. Every medieval artifact has this hidden cost embedded in it, human price paid by workers doing necessary but stigmatized labor. The tannery reveals this truth with particular clarity because the work is so viscerally unpleasant and the social rejection so unambiguous. But the pattern extends throughout medieval economy and society. Civilization was built on hierarchies of suffering, and someone always occupied the bottom tier. And so we come to the end of our week in the medieval tannery, emerging from those gates one final time as the autumn evening settles into comfortable darkness. You've walked through every stage of the process now, from the moment raw hides arrive to the final inspection of finished leather ready for craftsmen's hands. The smells still cling to your clothes and hair, but you've stopped noticing them quite so intensely, your senses accommodating to what once seemed unbearable. This is what the tanners meant when they said you get used to it, not that it stops being unpleasant, but that your body learns to function despite the unpleasantness, finding a kind of numb acceptance that allows daily life to continue. The apprentices are settling into their loft now, their voices drifting through the twilight, talking about nothing in particular, just the comfortable conversation of people who share difficult work and close quarters. Master Guillaume is securing the workshop, his movements practiced and economical, a man who has done these same closing tasks every evening for 30 years and will do them for 30 more if his body allows. Raoul is checking the tanning pits one last time, ensuring each hide is properly positioned for tomorrow's work. The compound is quieting into its nighttime rhythm, the pits continuing their slow chemical transformations while human workers rest. You're walking away from it all now, following the path back toward town, and the tannery compound is just a darker shadow in the gathering night, marked by a faint glow from a single lantern Guillaume left burning. The sound of water running through the troughs fades behind you, replaced by the softer sounds of evening distant voices, a dog barking, the creak of shutters closing against the autumn chill. Your body aches in that deep, settled way that comes from days of physical labor, a tiredness that sleep will soothe into recovery. Tomorrow you won't have to return to the lime pits or the baiting vats, won't have to scrape hides or stir tanning liquor or handle any of the countless disgusting tasks that fill a tanner's days. But somewhere, in this town and in every town across medieval Europe, tanners will wake tomorrow and return to that work, continuing the endless cycle that transforms death into utility, rot into durability, animal skin into one of civilization's most essential materials. They'll do it without recognition or respect, accepting social stigma as the price of employment, building lives within narrow boundaries defined by their profession. And they'll produce the leather that makes everything else possible, the shoes that let merchants travel, the books that preserve knowledge, the armor that protects warriors, the 1,000 useful objects that furnish daily life. Their work continues in the margins, essential but invisible, supporting civilization while remaining excluded from its benefits. Let that image settle into your thoughts now, the tannery compound in darkness, the patient soaking of hides in their pits, the slow transformation happening beneath wooden covers while workers sleep. It's a peaceful image in its own way. This industry of transformation, these alchemists of the practical who turn waste into wealth through patience and endurance and knowledge passed down through generations. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts drifting like the steam that rises from the lime pits in the cool morning air. The medieval world spins on through its cycles of work and rest, seasons and years, births and deaths, and somewhere in that vast pattern, tanners continue their necessary labor, unmarked by history but essential to its unfolding. Rest now, knowing that even the most difficult work finds its place in the larger pattern, that utility creates its own justification, that transformation, however unpleasant the process, is always worth witnessing.